The intermediate prophecy, the prophecy of the child who will overthrow the empire. In the throne room of a high fortified city, nestled somewhere in the cold cradle of the Zagros Mountains, a powerful king is deeply troubled. He is Astyages, ruler of the Medes, and the world as he knows it stretches out from his fortress in concentric rings of power, influence, and tribute. Yet a vision haunts his sleep, a crack in the divine order, a whisper that the entire edifice of his authority, built by his father and his grandfather, rests upon a fragile, predictable future. The prophecy concerns a child, not yet born, from his own bloodline, a child who will, the signs insist, overwhelm the very empire Astyages commands. This fear, this attempt to defy a future written in dreams, will become the engine that pulls the known world from one age into the next, setting the stage for a story of ambition, revenge, and the birth of an idea that would redefine global power. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where and when you're listening from tonight. Let us then begin, not with the child, but with the king who feared him, and the heavy silence of the royal court where this story first took root. Our primary guide for this particular chapter is the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, a master storyteller who gathered the whispers and legends of the lands he visited, weaving them into a grand tapestry of human conflict and divine will. In his telling, Astyages, the last king of the Medes, was visited by a profoundly disturbing dream centered on his daughter Mandane. He dreamt that from her, such a great quantity of water flowed that it not only filled his own city, but flooded the entirety of Asia, washing over kingdoms and drowning thrones. The vision was so stark, so physiologically impossible, yet symbolically potent, that he summoned his interpreters, the sacred priests known as the Magis, who specialized in divining the meanings hidden within the sleeping mind. Their interpretation was unambiguous and terrifying. His daughter's offspring would one day rise to rule in his place, usurping the Median crown and mastering the continent. Astyages, a man of his time, did not dismiss the prophecy. Rather, he sought to outwit it, to manage destiny through careful political calculation. He would not have his daughter assassinated. She was his own blood, but he would neutralize her political value. He refused to marry her to any of the powerful Median nobles within his court, any man whose own ambition might combine with the prophecy to create a genuine threat. Instead, he looked beyond his own people to the vassal territories that paid him tribute. He chose a husband for Mandane from among the Persians, a people then considered secondary, subjects of the Median crown. The man he selected was Cambyses III, a man of good family in his own land of Anshan, but critically, one whom Astyages perceived as quiet, unthreatening, and of a far gentler disposition than any high-ranking Mede. The threat, he believed, was contained, the prophecy cleverly defined by exiling its potential source to a politically minor marriage bed. But fate, especially in these ancient tales, is rarely so easily managed. Time passed, and Mandane became pregnant in her new Persian home. King Astyages, far away in his mountain capital of Ecbatana, dreamt a second time. This dream was perhaps even more vivid, more agricultural and elemental. He dreamt that a great vine grew from his daughter's womb, a plant of immense supernatural vitality. Its branches snaked outward, its tendrils reaching and grasping, climbing until its leaves cast a shadow over that very same territory from his first vision, all of Asia. The king awoke in the cold pre-dawn air, the image of that world-covering vine etched into his mind. He summoned the Magi once more, and their faces, illuminated by the torchlight of the court, confirmed his deepest anxieties. The first dream had been a warning, the second was a confirmation. The child now growing within Mandain was the threat, the usurper, the fulfillment of the prophecy. This time, the king's solution would be neither political nor subtle. It would be absolute. He commanded his pregnant daughter to travel from Anshan back to the Median court, a journey of many weeks, under the pretext of wishing to see her before the birth. Mandain, suspecting nothing, obeyed her father and king. She arrived, and in the fullness of time, within the very walls of Astyages' fortress, she gave birth to a son. The king wasted no time. He summoned his most trusted kinsman and courtier, a man named Harpagus, who served as his grand vizier and chief enforcer. Astyages explained the dreams, the prophecies, and the mortal danger this infant represented to the stability of the kingdom. He then gave Harpagus a direct and chilling order. Take the child, this newborn grandson, carry him out to the wildest part of the mountains, and leave him there to die, exposed to the cold, the wind, and the wolves. Harpagus, bound by loyalty and fear, bowed and accepted the child, wrapped in its royal blankets. He took the infant from the palace, his mind reeling from the gravity and the cruelty of the command. And it is here, in this moment of terrible decision, that the mechanism of the prophecy truly begins to turn. The king, in his desperate attempt to erase the future, had just handed the instrument of his own destruction to the very man who would one example. Archaeologists unearthed fragments of copper trade. The evidence gleamed faintly beneath layers of clay like forgotten sunlight. And the king, believing his order was carried out, believing the threat was finally buried in an unmarked rocky grave, settled back onto his throne. He had no way of knowing that this single act of fear would curdle into a long, patient, and devastating revenge. This story of the child, who we will come to know as Cyrus, and the grandfather Astyages, forms the dramatic bookend to the Median story. It is the legend of their ending. But to understand its beginning, to grasp the sheer scale of the world they built, and the power Astyages fought so desperately to protect, we must leave this haunted throne room. We must rewind the spool of time, back before the kings, before the capital, before the Medes were even a name whispered in fear, and travel instead to the land itself, the high, cold, and beautiful highlands that shaped them. We turn from the torchlit dread of Astyages' court and travel backward, far beyond the memory of kings and prophecies, to the land itself, the high, rugged cradle that would forge the Median people. This land, known in antiquity as Media, is not a gentle, fertile crescent like the river valleys of its neighbors. It is a fortress of geology, a vast and formidable landscape defined by the Zagros Mountains. Imagine a great spine of stone running for nearly 1,000 miles, a crumpled, dramatic barrier separating the low, hot, alluvial plains of Mesopotamia in the west from the high, arid central plateau of Iran in the east. This is the Median homeland, a place of sharp contrasts, biting winds, and profound, echoing silence. The mountains rise in parallel ridges, like great waves of earth frozen at their crest, creating deep, narrow valleys that carve through the landscape, isolating communities and nurturing a fierce spirit of independence. In the winter, the snowpack is immense, burying the high passes in drifts of white, cutting off travel for months at a time and forcing life to turn inward. Then, in the spring, a great melting occurs, the snows releasing their water into torrential streams and rivers like the Uzun, which cuts a winding, dramatic gorge through the stone, racing toward the distant Caspian Sea. This geography is not merely a backdrop. It is the single most important factor in understanding the people who would come to be called Medes. Life here was not easy. It was a negotiation with rock, altitude, and a harsh climate. The broad, flat plains of Mesopotamia to the west encouraged large, centralized agricultural empires built on irrigation and surplus grain, fostering cities like Nineveh or Babylon that sprawled across the landscape. But the Zagros valleys dictated a different path. Arable land was scarce, found only in the deep valley floors or on hard-won terraces cut into the slopes. The true wealth of these mountains was not in wheat, it was in grass. The high meadows and rolling uplands, cool and green in the summer, provided some of the finest pasture land in the ancient worlds. This was, above all, a land of pastoralists, a place where a people's status, power, and mobility were measured in livestock, especially in the magnificent horses that thrived in the high altitudes. The horses of Media, particularly those from the Nisaean plain, would become legendary, coveted by kings and generals far beyond the mountains, becoming a form of living tribute, a currency of power, and the engine of a new kind of warfare. The strategic position of this land was also crucial. To the east lay the vast Iranian plateau, a high, dry expanse that served as a highway for migrating peoples, a corridor for trade, and a source of constant cultural transmission. To the west, across the formidable mountain passes, lay the Assyrian heartland, a powerful, organized, and often brutal civilization that viewed the mountain peoples as a chaotic, tribal threat to be tamed, taxed, or exterminated. The Medes thus lived on a precipice, a borderland between the ancient, settled world of the Fertile Crescent and the wide, untamed steppes of Central Asia. The mountain passes, like the famed Zagros gates, were vital arteries. Whoever controlled them controlled the flow of trade, be it lapis lazuli from the east, tin for the bronze makers, or the lowland grain needed to supplement the meager mountain harvests. Control of these passes also meant security, the ability to close the door on invading armies, or, alternatively, to sally forth and raid the wealthy, vulnerable cities of the plains below. This dual nature, part isolated refuge, part strategic crossroads, would define the Median destiny. For centuries, this landscape prevented unity. The deep valleys and towering ridges did not foster a single cohesive state. They fostered a constellation of small, fiercely independent clans and tribes. Each valley might be home to a different chieftain, each stronghold loyal only to its local lord. This fragmentation, this tribal particularism, is what kept the mountain peoples weak in the face of the organized might of Mesopotamia for so long. An Assyrian king could march his army into one valley, demand tribute, burn a village, and declare Media subdued, all while a chieftain in the next valley, only 20 miles away over a high ridge, remained untouched and unaware, secure in his own rocky domain. This rugged isolation nurtured a culture of toughness, resilience, and a deep-seated distrust of centralized authority. The challenge for any future Median leader would not be conquering foreign lands. It would be the near impossible task of conquering their own geography, of binding these disparate, high-altitude tribes together, of convincing them that the bonds of shared language and culture were stronger than the stone walls of the valleys that separated them. This, then, was the canvas. It was a land of cold, clear air, of soaring eagles and distant snow-capped peaks. It was a place where the silence of the high pastures was broken only by the wind and the call of shepherds, and where the glow of a fortress fire on a distant hillside was the only sign of human habitation. Archaeologists digging into the mounds or tepes that dot this landscape find the story written in layers of earth. Small fortified settlements, evidence of horse burials, distinctive pottery styles, and the slow, gradual accumulation of wealth. They find places like Tepe Siauk to the east, or Godin Tepe, nestled in a high valley, which show the long, slow development of culture in this region, the arrival of new peoples, and the increasing sophistication of their metalwork. This was the world awaiting the arrival of the people who would give it their name, a challenging, beautiful, and demanding land that would shape their gods, their tempers, and their eventual explosive ascent to power. It was here, in these mountains, that the seeds of empire, the very one Astyages would one day fear to lose, were slowly, patiently biding their time. Into this high, silent land of stone and wind, a new people began to arrive, not in a single sudden wave of conquest, but as a slow, seeping tide of families and herds trickling down from the north and east over the course of many generations. These were the Iranian peoples, a distinct branch of the great Indo-European linguistic family, moving south from the vast grassy expanse of the Eurasian steppe, or perhaps filtering through the formidable gates of the Caucasus Mountains. They were not the first to walk these high passes. The lands were already home to older, settled cultures, like the Elamites in the southwest and the Hurrians. But this new migration, beginning perhaps in the second millennium BCE, would fundamentally rewrite the destiny of the entire plateau. They brought with them a different way of life, forged in the wide, open spaces of the north. They were semi-nomadic pastoralists, their lives governed by the needs of their flocks, their wealth measured in cattle, sheep, and most importantly, in the strong, swift horses that were their companions, their engines of war, and their most sacred possessions. They were a people of the horse, skilled riders who had perhaps mastered the art of fighting from horseback, a terrifying innovation that gave them a speed and mobility baffling to the foot soldiers of the established valley kingdoms. They also carried with them new technologies, like the spoked wheel and a different social structure, organized not around cities and irrigation canals, but around the tribe, the clan, and the warrior chieftain, a leader chosen for his prowess, his wealth in herds, and his ability to protect his people. They brought new gods, or rather a new sensibility toward the divine, one that revered the pure natural elements, the sun, the wind, the earth, and above all, fire, which they saw as a symbol of truth and life, an idea that would in time slowly blossom into the complex dualistic faith of Zoroastrianism. For centuries, however, they remained in the haze of prehistory, a pre-literate people leaving behind no texts of their own, no stone inscriptions to tell us their kings or their ambitions. Their first settlements were likely simple encampments of leather tents, dark shapes clustered in high pastures, their locations shifting with the seasons, leaving only the faintest traces for modern archaeologists to find. Our first fleeting glimpse of them, the first time their names are ever whispered into the light of recorded history, comes not from their own voices, but from the hard, cuneiform tablets of their neighbors, the powerful and highly organized Assyrian Empire to the west. Beginning in the 9th century BCE, the annals of the Assyrian kings, meticulous records of their military campaigns, begin to speak of new, troublesome peoples encountered in the eastern mountains. The scribes of kings like Shalmaneser III, etching their rulers' victories onto stone reliefs, mention campaigns into the Zagros, where they met a constellation of minor chieftains. In these texts, two names appear, listed among the many paying tribute: the Parsua, the Persians, settled farther south, and the Amadai or Madai, the Medes. This is their historical debut, not as a kingdom, but as a fragmented collection of highland tribes, significant enough to be rated, their primary value lying in the magnificent horses the Assyrians coveted for their own chariot corps. This historical ambiguity is matched by the archaeological record. There is no single Median invasion layer, no stark line of destruction and replacement. Instead, archaeologists find a slow, complex period of cultural change, a long debate known as the Median problem. In the high valleys of the Zagros, at sites like Godin Tepe, which we will revisit, investigators find that an older settlement was abandoned for a time, and then around the period of the migrations, a new fortified structure was built on the peak, a small, triangular citadel overlooking the valley. At other sites, a new style of simple, elegant pottery appears, a burnished gray or buff-colored ware, quite different from what came before. These subtle shifts, new pottery, new hilltop fortifications, new burial customs, are the faint material fingerprints of a new people arriving, settling, and beginning to adapt their nomadic ways to a more sedentary, fortress-based life in their new mountain home. For centuries, this was their world, a scattering of hilltop forts, each ruling a single valley, each led by a city lord, as the Assyrians called them, who might be rivals one day and allies the next, united only by a shared language, a shared culture, and increasingly, a shared and deeply resented oppressor on their western horizon. The name Mede was for now likely just an Assyrian label, a convenient shorthand for all the disparate, horse-rearing tribes of the central Zagros, who had no king and no capital, only the cold wind and the shadow of the greatest military power the world had yet seen. For nearly 3 centuries, the history of the Medes is written almost exclusively by their oppressors, a narrative etched not in their own language, but in the Akkadian cuneiform of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. From the 9th to the 7th centuries BCE, the Medes lived under the shadow of a terrible and relentless power, a sophisticated, bureaucratic, and exquisitely cruel war machine that had perfected the art of imperial domination. The Assyrian heartland centered on the great, fortified cities of Ashur, Nimrud, and the later magnificent Nineveh lay just across the Zagros, a constant, menacing presence. From these cities, the Assyrian kings, who styled themselves as the chosen regents of the god Ashur, would sally forth almost annually, their armies marching in disciplined, terrifying columns to remind the world of their mastery. Their royal annals, carved onto palace walls and stone stelae, are chronicles of this dominance, lists of conquered cities, subjugated peoples, and the vast systematic extraction of wealth that fueled their empire. And it is in these precise, boastful records that the distant Medes, the Madai, become a recurring feature, appearing not as a rival kingdom, but as a fractured resource to be harvested. The Assyrian relationship with the Median tribes was not one of occupation. The Zagros Mountains were too rugged, the tribes too scattered and mobile to be garrisoned and governed directly. It was, instead, a relationship of organized extortion, a system of punitive raids designed to enforce the payment of tribute. An Assyrian monarch, such as Tiglath-Pileser III or the infamous Sargon the Tenth, would lead his army through the high passes, his scribes recording the campaign with grim satisfaction. They speak of penetrating deep into the land of the mighty Medes, of burning their hilltop fortresses, which they described as mere nests perched on mountainsides, and of receiving the panicked submission of countless city lords. These local chieftains, each ruling perhaps a single valley or a small cluster of villages, would hasten to meet the Assyrian columns, bringing with them the only treasure the Assyrians truly coveted from these high, cold lands: horses. Horses were the oil, the steel, the jet fuel of the Assyrian military. While the Mesopotamian plains were ideal for agriculture, they were poor pasture land for raising the high-quality war horses needed for the empire's most devastating weapon, the chariot corps, and later, its burgeoning cavalry. The high meadows of the Zagros, however, produced animals of legendary strength, speed, and stamina. The Assyrian reliefs from the palaces at Nineveh depict this relationship with chilling clarity. Endless processions of bearded Median chieftains, distinct in their tunics and soft boots, are shown leading their prized horses, animals depicted with arched necks and powerful builds, presenting them as tribute to the enthroned Assyrian king. Scribes stand by, a stylus poised over a clay tablet, meticulously counting the animals. One inscription of Sargon II, detailing his campaign in 716 BCE, boasts of receiving tribute from no fewer than 28 city lords of the Medes, while another from Esarhaddon describes his deep penetration into the salt desert on the plateau's edge, reaching a land of which the kings my fathers had not heard, all to secure new sources of horses and tribute. This relentless pressure had a profound, transformative, and entirely unintentional effect on the Median tribes. The Assyrians, in their arrogance, saw the Medes as a permanent buffer zone, a chaotic frontier they could raid at will. But this shared victimhood became the first, crucial catalyst for Median unity. The disparate clans, so long isolated by their own geography and mutual suspicion, began to experience a common grievance, a shared enemy that was predictable only in its brutality. The annual threat of the Assyrian tax collector, backed by an army that practiced mass deportation, flaying, and impalement as standard policy, provided a powerful, clarifying incentive to cooperate. A single city lord in a single valley was helpless. He could either pay the crippling tribute of his best horses, or see his fortress burned and his people scattered. But what if several valleys? What if dozens of chieftains agreed to act as one? What if they pooled their resources, their warriors, and their horses, not just to resist, but to strike back? This constant external threat was the anvil, and the Assyrian army was the hammer, slowly, violently forging a scattered confederation into the blade of a nascent state. The Assyrian records themselves hint at this slow consolidation. While they speak of dozens of minor lords, they occasionally mention a figure who seems to hold more sway, a chieftain who brings the tribute of others, acting as a regional intermediary. And in the silences of the landscape, archaeology provides another clue. At sites like Tepe Nush-i Jan, a striking fortified complex with a central fire temple would be built atop a high mound, a structure far too sophisticated and large to be the work of a single minor village. It suggests a pooling of resources, a centralized authority, a gathering place for a community larger than a single clan. The Assyrians, busy counting their horses and carving their victory reliefs, seem to have remained oblivious to the political evolution they were themselves provoking. They saw fragmented subjects. They failed to see the slow, subterranean joining of roots, the formation of a collective will hardened by resentment and the desperate need for survival. They were, in essence, teaching their future destroyers how to organize. The shadow they cast was long and dark, but in that very darkness, the first sparks of a unified Median identity were being kindled, awaiting only a leader bold enough to fan them into a flame. From the hard, boastful tablets of the Assyrian kings, we inherit a name, the Madai, the Medes. We see them as a fragmented people, a constellation of hilltop chiefs scattered across the high Zagros, known primarily as a source of tribute, a restless frontier from which magnificent horses could be regularly and violently extracted. For centuries, this is the only contemporary lens we have. But this very scarcity of information, this gap between the scattered city lords of the Assyrian annals and the mighty world-changing empire that will later co-destroy Nineveh, gives rise to one of the most profound and fascinating debates in ancient Near Eastern history. We have arrived in our quiet journey at the heart of what scholars call the Median problem. The question is deceptively simple, yet its tendrils reach into the very nature of how we write history. Was there ever a unified, powerful, centralized Median kingdom before the final dramatic decades of the 7th century BCE? Or was Made, for most of its history, simply an ethnic label, a convenient geographical term used by outsiders to describe a mosaic of disparate, independent highland tribes who shared a language and a lifestyle, but no single throne? For most of history, this was not a problem at all. The story was clear, laid out for us with compelling narrative force by the Greek historian Herodotus, the father of history, who wrote his great work in the 5th century BCE. His account, which we will begin to explore in detail, is linear, dramatic, and dynastic. He presents us with a clear four-king succession for the Median Empire, a wise founder named Deioces, his ambitious son Phraortes, the great unifier and conqueror Cyaxares, and finally the ill-fated Astyages, the king of the prophecy. In this telling, the Median state is a deliberate creation, founded by a single brilliant man who unites the tribes through wisdom and political theater. This kingdom, in Herodotus's view, grows steadily, challenging Assyria, conquering the Persians, and ruling a vast territory for over a century before it is finally, and ironically, undone by its own founder's descendant. For millennia, this was the accepted history, a neat and satisfying prelude to the rise of Cyrus the Great. But in the past century, as the tools of archaeology and textual criticism have become more precise, this tidy narrative has begun to unravel. The problem arises from a glaring, echoing silence in the evidence. Let us first consider the Assyrians themselves. Their scribes, as we have noted, were meticulous record keepers. When they fought a rival kingdom, they named its king. They speak constantly of the kings of Elam, the kings of Urartu in the north, the pharaohs of Egypt, and the troublesome rulers of Babylon. Yet in the hundreds of references to the Medes, spanning from the 9th century down to the very eve of Assyria's collapse, not once do their annals mention a king of Media. They never name a Deiosis or a Phraortes. They speak only of city lords, chiefs of the Medes, or mayors of specific towns, often boasting of receiving tribute from dozens of them simultaneously. This is a profound argument from silence. If a powerful unified kingdom was rising on their eastern flank, a rival capable of challenging their might, as Herodotus suggests Phraortes did, how could the sophisticated Assyrian intelligence and propaganda machine have failed to notice, or at least failed to name, its singular royal opponent? This textual silence is mirrored in the earth itself. An empire, even a nascent one, leaves a significant footprint. It builds monumental palaces, vast city walls, and royal tombs. It produces state-sponsored art and crafts. It leaves behind a uniform material culture that spreads across its territory. To date, for the 8th and early 7th centuries BCE, the supposed time of Deiosis and Phraortes, the archaeological record for a grand Median capital is stubbornly blank. Ecbatana, the city Herodotus describes as a magnificent, seven-walled wonder, remains almost entirely elusive, buried deep beneath the modern, living city of Hamadan, preventing the kind of large-scale excavation that uncovered Nineveh or Babylon. The other sites we have found from this period, such as Godin Tepe, or the fascinating religious complex of Tepe Nushijan, are compelling, but they do not look like the centers of an empire. They appear to be heavily fortified manors, the strongholds of powerful local chieftains, the very city lords the Assyrians describe, ruling over a single valley, but not a vast unified state. There is no imperial Median pottery style, no royal statuary, no Median cuneiform to tell us their side of the story. So how do we reconcile these two starkly different pictures? The modern consensus leans heavily toward the skeptical view. It suggests that Herodotus, writing 200 years after the fact and relying on Persian oral traditions, likely telescoped history. He took the reality of the late Median kingdom, the powerful, unified state forged by Cyaxares, whom the Assyrians do mention, to fight them, and projected its existence backward, creating a tidy Greek-style dynastic narrative for what was, in reality, a much more chaotic, fragmented, and pre-state period. The Mades of the 8th century were likely a people bound by a shared ethno-linguistic identity, a common Iranian culture of horse breeding, pastoralism, and emerging religious ideas. But they were not yet a nation. They were a potential, a confederation of tribes, a state in formation, slowly and violently being nudged toward unity by the relentless pressure of their shared Assyrian enemy. The Median problem, thus reminds us of a crucial lesson: that history is not always a clean line of kings, but often a messy, complex process, and the Mede was for a very long time an idea and a people before it was ever an empire. To understand how it became one, we must first turn to the legend that Herodotus preserved, the foundational myth of the man who, he insists, first brought order from that chaos. We are faced, then, with a profound quiet from the earth and a silence from the contemporary scribes. The Median problem leaves us with a landscape of scattered, fortified manors and a people known only as the Medes, a loose confederation of tribes without a central, guiding hand. Into this historical vacuum steps the grand, organizing voice of Herodotus, writing centuries later, offering us not just a solution, but a compelling human story, a foundational myth for the entire Median enterprise. He explains how this fractured people, living in a state of near anarchy, deliberately and rationally chose to surrender their chaotic freedom for the security of a single, powerful ruler. This is the tale of the first king, Deioces, a man who, according to the legend, built a nation not with the sword, but with the scales of justice and a brilliant understanding of political theater. Herodotus begins his account by painting a picture of Median life after they had, in a perhaps optimistic reading, shaken off the yoke of Assyrian control, or perhaps, in a more general sense, were simply living without any overarching authority. The land, he tells us, was gripped by anomia, a profound lawlessness. In the absence of a king, banditry was rife, disputes were settled by violence, and no man's property or life was secure. The deep valleys and isolated settlements that define the Zagros geography only exacerbated this fragmentation. Into this chaos steps a figure named Deioces, the son of Phraortes, a man of no particular rank, but of considerable natural wisdom, living in one of the many small Median villages. He saw the injustice that flourished around him and began to put his talents to use. He offered himself as an arbiter, a judge for the disputes within his own community. His reputation for fairness, for decisions that were so impeccably just and impartial, soon spread beyond his own village. The men of the neighboring villages, weary of the violence and the costly, endless feuds, heard of this remarkable judge. They began to bypass their own local strongmen and brought their most complex grievances to Deioces. The queues outside his modest home grew longer. A man from a distant valley, having heard that Deioces' judgments were always honored, would travel for days, bringing his property dispute or his accusation of theft, and he would receive a hearing that was fair, final, and respected. Deioces, Herodotus tells us, knew exactly what was happening. He was not just settling disputes, he was acquiring power, a power based not on coercion, but on reputation and a desperate public need. He was becoming the indispensable man, the single point of order in a fractured world. And once he understood this, he made his move. He announced quite suddenly that he was retiring from public life. He declared that it was no longer sustainable for him to spend all his days judging the affairs of others while neglecting his own household, and that, frankly, the thankless task brought him nothing but trouble. His withdrawal had the immediate, calculated effect he desired. The lawlessness, which his presence had held in check, returned with a vengeance. Theft, violence, and insecurity surged, now seeming even more intolerable to a populace that had tasted the peace of impartial justice. The Mades, Herodotus says, gathered in a great assembly, their leaders and chieftains lamenting the state of their country. They could not, they argued, continue to live in this chaotic land. They would be driven out, or they would be picked off, one, by their organized enemies, namely the Assyrians. The solution, they concluded, was to do what their neighbors had done. They must appoint a king. They must subordinate their individual, tribal freedoms to a single central authority who could enforce one law for all. The debate, we are told, was short. The supporters of Deioces, who had likely orchestrated this entire public discussion, immediately stood and put his name forward. Who else, they argued, could be their king but the one man who had already proven he alone could bring justice and order to their people? The motion was carried, and Deioces, the humble village arbiter, was acclaimed king of the Medes. His transformation was immediate and absolute. This story, which sounds so much like a Greek philosophical parable on the origins of the state, a social contract theory born in the Zagros, now shifts to a description of masterful, autocratic stagecraft. Deioces' first demand was not for an army, but for symbols of power. He demanded the Medes build him a personal bodyguard to ensure his safety and enforce his new royal will. His second demand was far grander. He commanded them to abandon their scattered hilltop villages and come together to build him a single, vast, and magnificent capital city. This city, Herodotus names as Ecbatana, a fortress of almost mythical splendor, which we will explore in its own time. Once these were granted, Deioces, the accessible judge, vanished. He secluded himself within his new palace, instituting a complex and rigid court etiquette designed to elevate him from a man into a monarch. No one was permitted to see the king directly. All petitions, all disputes, had to be submitted in writing, delivered by messengers, with the king's judgment returned in the same impersonal way. He forbade any man from laughing or, most strangely, from spitting in the royal presence, or even in the royal audience hall. Herodotus, ever the astute political analyst, explains the brilliant psychology behind this. Deioces, who had been raised with these same chieftains, who was their equal in birth, knew that if they saw him day to day, they would be consumed by envy and prone to conspiracy. But by rendering himself invisible, by wrapping himself in mystery, ceremony, and a manufactured divine-like remoteness, he might seem to be of a different mold from ordinary mortals. He created an aura of awe and fear, the necessary ingredients for a stable throne built over a collection of proud, unruly warriors. This, then, is the foundational legend. While modern historians, noting the silence in the Assyrian texts, may rightly suspect this tale is a later invention, or perhaps the embellished biography of a local chieftain, a Dayoku mentioned by Sargon the Second as being captured and deported, its symbolic truth is immense. It is the story the Medes told themselves about why they were a kingdom, not because a great warrior conquered them, but because they chose order over chaos, justice over anarchy, and submitted to the wisdom of one man, who then cloaked himself in the terrifying majesty of a true Eastern king. The first and most profound demand of the newly proclaimed King Deioces, the man who had traded his judge's robes for the invisible mantle of a monarch, was for a capital. He would no longer rule from a simple village or a modest fortified manor. He would command his new, unified people from a city built to be the physical manifestation of his absolute and remote authority. This city, which the Greeks would come to know as Ekbatana, was to be the center of the Median world, a fortress of such unique and symbolic design that its very architecture would broadcast the king's power to the distant, scattered tribes. The Medes, having submitted to his rule, now collectively submitted to his grand design, abandoning their small, vulnerable hilltop settlements and coming together for this monumental act of state building. The site they chose was a hill rising from a broad plain, a location that offered both natural defense and a commanding view of the surrounding lands, a place known today as the modern, living city of Hamadan. Our only detailed vision of this nascent capital, this fortress of the first king, comes from the vivid account of Herodotus. His description is so specific, so fantastical, that it hovers in the mist between historical reportage and mythic archetype. He tells us that Deioces commanded the Medes to build a city of immense size and strength, constructed in a series of 7 concentric, circular walls. The design was a masterpiece of political and symbolic geography. Each ring or battlement was built to be progressively taller than the one outside it, so that from the plain, an approaching visitor would see a rising, multi-tiered crown of stone, culminating in the king's palace at the very center. It was a fortress designed as a microcosm of the cosmos, a layered universe with the king at its still, divine point. The innermost circle, the smallest and highest, enclosed the royal palace itself and the treasuries, the heart of the new Median state, visible from all around, yet completely inaccessible to the common person. What truly captured the imagination of the Greek world, however, was not just the geometry, but the color. Herodotus reports that Deioces had the battlements of each of the 7 walls painted in a different, specific hue, creating a dazzling, rainbow-like effect that would have shimmered in the clear, high-altitude light. The outermost and largest wall, the one that defined the city's public perimeter, was painted a stark white. The second wall was black. The third was a deep, royal purple or scarlet. The fourth was a brilliant celestial blue, and the fifth was a vibrant orange or red. These 5 rings, colorful and imposing, formed the outer defenses, the concentric layers of security and state apparatus. But it was the final 2 innermost walls that truly signified the king's new status. The 6th wall, the one immediately surrounding the royal acropolis, was said to be plated entirely in gleaming silver, and the 7th, the final highest wall that shielded the king's own palace from view, was plated in a blinding, radiant gold. Scholars have long debated the meaning of this spectacular design. It seems to echo the cosmological ideas of their neighbors in Babylon, where the number 7 was sacred, often linked to the 7 known celestial bodies: the moon, silver, the sun, gold, and the 5 planets visible to the naked eye, each associated with a specific color. Ekbatana, in this reading, was not just a city, it was a cosmogram, a diagram of the heavens brought to earth, a place where the king sat at the center of a divinely ordered universe, as immovable and central as the sun itself. It was the ultimate expression of the remote, ceremonial kingship Deioces had instituted. The common Mede, living in the white-walled outer ring, was now separated from his monarch by layers of black, purple, blue, orange, silver, and gold, an unbridgeable symbolic gulf that cemented the king's elevation from a simple judge to a semi-divine ruler. This is the legend. The Median problem, however, returns with frustrating force when we try to touch this city with a spade. Ecbatana is almost certainly buried beneath modern Hamadan, one of the oldest and most continuously inhabited cities on the planet. For millennia, Parthians, Sasanians, Arabs, Seljuks, and modern Iranians have built their homes, mosques, and bazaars directly atop the ruins of Deiosis' fabled capital. This living, breathing city makes a large-scale excavation of the kind that uncovered Nineveh or Babylon impossible. We are left with only tantalizing, fleeting glimpses. Archaeologists, in limited soundings where they can find space, have reached levels from the Median and Achaemenid periods. They have found column bases, fragments of fortification, and fine pottery, but nothing approaching the seven-walled fortress of Herodotus. Nearby, on the slopes of Mount Alvand, the Achaemenid kings Darius and Xerxes would later carve the Gujnami inscriptions, a testament to the site's enduring importance as a royal center. But the Median capital itself, the city of Deiosis, remains a tantalizing ghost, its golden and silver walls lost beneath the concrete and asphalt of its modern descendant. Was Herodotus's account, then, pure fantasy? Perhaps not entirely. It is highly unlikely the walls were plated in solid precious metals. This is almost certainly the embellishment of a good story. A more sober hypothesis suggests the colors may have been a reference to the vibrant glazed bricks that were a hallmark of Mesopotamian monumental architecture, a technology the Medes may have borrowed and adapted. The Ishtar Gate of Babylon, though built later, is a stunning example of this art, its walls covered in brilliant blue and yellow glazed tiles depicting lions and dragons. Perhaps Ecbatana was an early and magnificent example of this same tradition, but whether it was literally true or a symbolic exaggeration, the idea of Ecbatana served its purpose. It was the story of the Median capital, a place of celestial order and unimaginable wealth that cemented their reputation. It was the stage, real or imagined, upon which Deiosis' son would inherit a kingdom that was no longer a scattered collection of tribes, but a centralized state with a glittering, formidable heart. From the glittering, concentric walls of Ecbatana, the new Median state was governed in awe-filled silence, the legacy of Deiosis, the judge-king who had cloaked himself in mystery. He had ruled, according to the legends, for 53 years, a long and steady reign that allowed the foundations of his new state to set like mortar. When he finally passed, the throne did not revert to the chaos of the tribes. It passed, for the first time in their history, directly to his son. This heir, known to us as Phraortes, inherited a kingdom his ancestors could not have imagined. He inherited a centralized bureaucracy, a fortified capital that was a marvel of symbolic power, a swelling treasury, and most importantly, a unified Median people, their tribal loyalties now subordinate to the single royal will. But where Deiosis had been a man of wisdom, patience, and political stagecraft, his son Phraortes was a man of a different, more conventional temperament. He saw the magnificent tool his father had forged, this united horse-powered army, and he was consumed by the desire to use it. Phraortes, Herodotus tells us, was not content to be king of the Medes only. The long, patient work of consolidation was done. The age of ambition, of imperial expansion, had now begun. His gaze fell first upon his neighbors to the south, his fellow Iranian kinsmen, the Parsua, the Persians. They were, at this time, a subordinate people, a collection of tribes living in the highlands of Anshan and Fars, much as the Medes themselves had been only a few generations prior. Phraortes gathered the Median army, no longer a loose confederation of valley chieftains, but a royal force marching under a single banner, and descended from his high capital. The campaign, as Herodotus relates it, was decisive. The Persians, lacking the central organization the Medes had so recently acquired, were the first of all to be subdued, and Phraortes brought them under the dominion of the Medes. This was a fateful, critical act, a moment that would ripple down through the century. By conquering the Persians, Phraortes bound their destiny to his own. He brought the Persian nobility, including the royal line of Achaemenes, into the Median sphere, making them vassals of Ecbatana, a decision that would, in the time of his own grandson, prove to be the mechanism of prophecy. Having brought the Persians into his fold, and as Herodotus claims, extended his dominion over other peoples of the plateau, Phraortes' ambition swelled. He looked west, beyond the Zagros, to the flat, wealthy, and terrifying plains of Mesopotamia. He looked upon the great ancestral enemy, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. For centuries, this empire had been the hammer, and his people the anvil. It was the Assyrian tribute raids that had bled his ancestors, the Assyrian kings who had boasted of burning Median fortresses and carrying off their horses. Now, from his silver and gold-walled citadel, Phraortes believed the balance of power had finally shifted. His father had built a kingdom in defiance of Assyria's shadow. He would be the king to extinguish that shadow. He made the audacious, almost unthinkable decision to launch a direct, offensive war against the masters of the known world, to march on Nineveh itself. Here, our story encounters the familiar mist of the Median problem. While Herodotus presents a clear, linear narrative of a Median king invading Assyria, the Assyrian records, in their final anxious decades, speak of a slightly different, though related threat. Cuneiform tablets from the reign of the Assyrian king Esarhaddon and later his son Ashurbanipal are filled with dreadful portents and spy reports concerning the Zagros. They speak not of a Phraortes, but of a powerful chieftain named Keshtariti, ruler of a fortress called Karkashi. This Keshtariti, who historians increasingly suspect is the historical figure behind the Greek name Phraortes, was not acting alone. He was a master diplomat, a unifier on a grand scale, and he was attempting to build a massive anti-Assyrian coalition. The Assyrian oracles, known as queries to the sun god, are riddled with the king's desperate questions. Will Kashtariti and his allies succeed? Will the Manians, the Scythians, and the Medes unite and march against us? This suggests a far more complex political reality. Phraortes and Kashtariti was not just a reckless aggressor, but a cunning political operator, attempting to coordinate a multi-front war, bringing in steppe nomads, the Scythians, and other mountain peoples to finally break the Assyrian hegemon. But whatever the precise diplomatic prelude, the outcome, as recorded by Herodotus, was an unmitigated disaster. The Grand Coalition, if it existed, may have fractured, or perhaps the Scythian allies proved unreliable. Herodotus, in his starker telling, simplifies the event to a fatal miscalculation of Median strength. Phraortes, at the head of his unified army, marched out of the high mountains, leaving the safety of his terrain, and descended onto the Mesopotamian plains, the traditional killing field of the Assyrian war machine. The Assyrian army he faced, likely under the command of the great and terrible Ashurbanipal, was not a collection of horse-riding pastoralists. It was the most sophisticated, disciplined, and technologically advanced military force on Earth, a combined arms behemoth of heavy infantry, slingers, archers, battle-hardened cavalry, and the devastating heavy-wheeled war chariots that dominated the flatland. The battle, when it was joined, was not a contest. It was a slaughter. Herodotus delivers the epitaph in a single, brutal sentence. Phraaortes, after a reign of 22 years, perished in that expedition, he and his army with him. The first great offensive venture of the Median kingdom, the grand ambition of its second king, was utterly shattered. The king was dead, his body likely lost on the field, and the professional army his father had so carefully built was broken and scattered. The news would have raced back to Ecbatana, a wave of shock and terror. The kingdom was now leaderless, its defenses compromised, its grand capital suddenly vulnerable to the one thing it had been built to defy: a massive Assyrian counter-invasion. The gamble of Phraaortes had failed spectacularly, and in doing so, he had not only reaffirmed Assyrian dominance, but had also thrown his entire nascent kingdom into a desperate crisis, creating a vacuum of power in the high Zagros, a vacuum that would not be filled by the Assyrians, but by a new and even more terrifying force from the steppes, whose arrival would nearly extinguish the Median story altogether. The catastrophic gamble of Phraaortes had cost the Medes their king, their army, and their newfound sense of invincibility, leaving a smoking ruin on the plains outside Nineveh and a terrifying power vacuum in the high Zagros. The Assyrians, though victorious, were weakened by decades of constant warfare. Their empire stretched thin and brittle. They were in no position to occupy the Median heartland, nor did they need to. The crisis that followed the battle did not come from the organized, predictable malice of the Assyrian state. It came, as it so often did in the ancient world, from the wide, open grasslands of the north, a direction from which chaos itself seemed to flow. A new, terrifying, and utterly alien force of nomadic warriors, masters of the horse and bow, swept down from the passes of the Caucasus, a human tide that would pour over the region and nearly drown the Median project in its cradle. These were the Scythians, and their arrival marked the beginning of a dark, chaotic period that Greek historians would later call the Scythian Interregnum. These were not the first steppe peoples the region had seen, but they were perhaps the most formidable. The Scythians were a confederation of Iranian-speaking tribes, born in the vast, limitless ocean of grass that stretched across Central Asia, and they were the undisputed masters of mounted warfare. They were a people who, as Herodotus famously quipped, had no cities or forts, but carried their houses with them, their possessions loaded onto great wagons. They were, in essence, a mobile kingdom of archers. They had perfected the art of shooting the powerful composite bow from horseback, a devastating tactic that allowed them to strike with lethal speed and accuracy, melting away before any slower, heavy infantry force could even form a battle line. They lived and died in the saddle, and their culture was one of ferocious martial prowess, their animal-style art, full of swirling predatory beasts reflecting their worldview. Their elite warriors, according to Herodotus, even drank from the gilded skulls of their slain enemies. Herodotus provides a dramatic, if perhaps simplified, narrative for their sudden appearance. He claims they were in pursuit of another nomadic group, the Cimmerians, whom they had chased out of the steppes and across the Caucasus Mountains, spilling into the Near East in a wave of destruction. Another, more plausible tradition suggests a more complex political game. The weakened Assyrians, desperate for allies in their struggle against the rising Median Babylonian threat, may have invited the Scythians in, hiring them as mercenaries, only to find they had unleashed a monster they could not control. Or perhaps, in the most tangled scenario, these were the very Scythians that Phraaortes, as Kashtaridi, had tried to recruit for his own grand coalition, who upon his death simply took advantage of the chaos to seize the entire region for themselves. Whatever the precise cause, the effect was the same. The leader of this Scythian horde, a king named Madias, saw a leaderless Media and a weakened Mesopotamia and simply took control. This was not an empire of administration. It was an empire of plunder. Herodotus states in a stark and specific claim that the Scythians held the dominion of Asia for 28 years. This dominion was a reign of terror. They did not build cities. They did not collect taxes in any organized way. They ruled with violence and insolence, sweeping across the land, their horse gangs demanding tribute, grain, and wealth from every settled community. They rode where they pleased, their power unchecked. They pushed into Syria, raided the Levant, and in a famous episode were only stopped at the very frontier of Egypt when the pharaoh Psammetichus I met them with gifts and prayers, bribing them to turn back from his wealthy kingdom. For the Medes, this was a humiliation far deeper than the Assyrian tribute. The Assyrians were a settled rival civilization, but the Scythians were a nomadic storm, an occupying force that feasted in their halls and treated their nobility with contempt. The entire Median state-building project, the careful concentric order of Deiosis, and the bold ambition of Phraaortes was completely suspended, frozen in place. The young son of Phraaortes, Cyaxares, inherited a throne that was now little more than a tributary title. He was a king in name only, forced to bow to Scythian warlords in his own capital of Ecbatana, compelled to provision them, to endure their arrogance, and to watch as they bled his land dry. The archaeological record from this period reflects this disruption. Across the Near East, a sudden scattering of Scythian-style grave goods appears. Distinctive bronze arrowheads, horse harnesses, and weapons, the material footprint of a new, mobile, and dominant military elite. This interregnum was a long, bitter winter for the Median people, but it was also a crucible. The young, humiliated Cyaxares was not just enduring, he was observing. He was watching these stepmasters, learning their tactics, their speed, their ruthlessness, and their weaknesses. He was forced to be patient, to bide his time, to swallow his pride, and to wait for the perfect moment to reclaim his father's kingdom and turn this tide of chaos back upon itself. The 28 years of Scythian rule, if that number is to be believed, was a brutal education, but one that would ultimately forge the greatest king the Medes would ever know. The long, bitter winter of the Scythian occupation, those 28 years of humiliation, if we follow the Greek account, had frozen the Median state-building project in its tracks. The king, Cyaxares, son of the defeated Phraortes and grandson of the great unifier Deioces, was a monarch in name only, a tributary lord forced to host his arrogant, nomadic masters in the very halls of Ecbatana. He had inherited a kingdom that was not his to command, his throne little more than a gilded chair in an occupied land. But this long period of subjugation was not an empty time. It was a brutal and transformative education. Cyaxares was a man forged in resentment, a patient observer who watched the Scythian warlords, their tactics, their arrogance, their devastating speed, and their critical, gluttonous weaknesses. He was learning, waiting, and allowing the collective hatred of his people for these unpredictable overlords to simmer and clarify into a single, sharp point of national feeling. He was, in this quiet, watchful period, becoming the unifier his kingdom had been waiting for, a man who would prove to be as cunning as his grandfather and far more ruthless than his father. His challenge was twofold. He not only had to reclaim his kingdom from the Scythian horde, but he first had to reclaim his own people. The Median nobility, the powerful chieftains of the Zagros valleys, had been scattered and cowed, each paying their own tribute to the local Scythian bands, their loyalty to the central throne in Ecbatana, now a distant memory. Before he could strike at the enemy, Cyaxares had to reforge the chains of loyalty that bound his own state together. He must have traveled in secret or sent trusted emissaries from one valley fortress to the next, his whispers finding purchase in the hearts of chieftains who were also weary of the violence and insolence of their occupiers. He was not just a king demanding fealty. He was a patriot organizing a conspiracy, a focal point for a shared and desperate desire for liberation. He bound them to his cause, not just with promises of future glory, but with a plan of shocking, patient, and terrible treachery. The account of this liberation, passed down to us by Herodotus, has all the hallmarks of a grand, dark folk tale, a foundational myth of a kingdom reborn through a single calculated act of violence. Cyaxares, having secured the secret pledges of his Median lords, made a great show of his continued friendship and submission to the Scythian king Madias and his court. He invited them to a magnificent banquet within the walls of Ecbatana. The Scythian leaders, arrogant in their long-held power, and perhaps seeing this as nothing more than another payment of tribute in the form of a feast, accepted the invitation. They rode into the Median capital, their horses clattering on the paved courtyards, their unkempt, nomadic energy a stark contrast to the ordered, colorful walls of Deioces' city. They entered the great megaron, or feasting hall of the palace, the very center of Median power, and saw it prepared not for war, but for revelry. The fires in the central hearths would have burned high, casting a warm, flickering glow on the painted timbers of the ceiling. The long tables were laden with roasted meats, with breads and fruits, and most critically, with an endless, flowing supply of wine, the potent, sweet wine of the Zagros slopes, a drink far stronger and more intoxicating than the fermented mare's milk or kumis of the steppes. Cyaxares played the part of the perfect, subservient host, his Median nobles attending to their guests, filling their cups again and again toasting their strength, their victories, their unbreakable friendship. The Scythian lords, warriors who lived in the saddle, were perhaps unused to this kind of settled, Babylonian-style indulgence. They feasted and they drank, their arrogance dissolving into a boisterous, drunken stupor. Their sharp, predatory senses, honed on the open steppe, were dulled by the wine, the heat, and the thick, deceptive fug of hospitality. They were warriors without their horses, archers without their wits, trapped in a stone box of their own overconfidence. Cyaxares watched, his patience holding, until the moment was perfect, until the great warlords of the steppe were slumped in their seats, their weapons loose, their eyes glazed, their loud boasts faded into senseless murmurs. Then, at a silent, pre-arranged signal from the king, the doors of the hall were barred. The Median nobles, who had been feigning drunkenness themselves, drew the short swords and daggers they had concealed in their robes. In a sudden, terrible, and coordinated act of assassination, they fell upon their incapacitated guests. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The invincible masters of Asia, the men who had terrified the known world from Egypt to Iran, were slaughtered in a single, wine-soaked night, their long dominion ending not on a battlefield, but on the floor of a feasting hall. The nightmare was over. This story, whether it is a literal truth or a symbolic legend representing a more complex campaign, marks the true birth of Cyaxares as king. The news of the massacre in the palace would have spread like wildfire. The scattered Scythian bands, still roaming the countryside, now suddenly leaderless, their central command structure annihilated, were thrown into complete disarray. They were no longer an occupying army. They were a panicked, disorganized mob, and Cyaxares, seizing the momentum, immediately unleashed his newly unified Median army to hunt them down and drive them from his lands. The liberator, in this one dark night, had proven his authority, his cunning, and his absolute right to rule. The Median chieftains, who had participated in the conspiracy, were now bound to him by an unbreakable oath of shared blood and shared victory. The Median problem, that old fragmentation of the tribes, was solved. Cyaxares had emerged from the chaos as the undisputed master of Media, his power centralized and his authority absolute, forged in a crucible of occupation and sealed in a conspiracy of blood. He now had a truly unified people, an army loyal to his single command, and a lifetime of lessons learned from his oppressors. His gaze now turned outward, not with the reckless ambition of his father, but with the cold, patient strategy of a man who knew exactly how to dismantle an empire. With the Scythian leadership annihilated in a single, brutal night of state-sponsored assassination and their disorganized bands routed from the high valleys, Cyaxares stood as the undisputed, liberated master of Media. He had reclaimed his throne, not through inheritance, but through cunning, blood, and the unified will of his nobility. The 28-year interregnum was over, but as the smoke cleared and the last of the steppe raiders were driven back across the Araxes River, Cyaxares did not allow his kingdom to settle into a comfortable, easy peace. His liberation of Media was not the end of his ambition. It was merely the prelude, the necessary first step. The humiliation of the Scythian occupation was now eclipsed by the far older, deeper wound that still festered in the Median memory, the ancestral shadow of Assyria, the power that had broken his father Phraortes, and bled his people for generations. He had avenged his kingdom. He would now avenge his father. Cyaxares, however, was a far more patient and calculating man than Phraortes. He had learned from his father's catastrophic failure. He understood that the old Median army, the one that had been shattered on the plains of Mesopotamia, was fundamentally inadequate for his purpose. It had been a tribal levy, a force bound by the charisma of a king, but organized by the loyalties of the clan. A powerful chieftain from a Zagros valley would arrive with his men, a chaotic mix of horsemen and spearmen fighting under his banner, loyal first to their local lord and second to the king. This, Cyaxares now knew, was no way to fight the most sophisticated military machine on earth, but his education had been twofold. He had not only endured the Scythians, he had studied them. He had seen firsthand the devastating power of specialized mobile warfare, the clouds of mounted archers who could strike and vanish, who represented a speed and lethality that no infantry line could counter. He also understood, from the long and bitter history of his people, the Assyrian way of war. He knew that their strength lay not in any single unit, but in their revolutionary, terrifying concept of combined arms. The Assyrian army was a disciplined, balanced engine where heavy infantry held the center. Slingers and archers provided a relentless barrage from the rear. Chariots broke the enemy line, and cavalry exploited the gaps. It was a system, a machine, where each part had a distinct and drilled function. This was the lesson he took to heart. His father had tried to fight this machine with a brave, disorganized horde. Cyaxares would fight it by building a better machine, and so, as Herodotus tells us with uncharacteristic precision, Cyaxares, in the quiet years after his liberation, undertook a military revolution. He was, the historian states, the first to divide his troops into companies and to form the spearmen, the archers, and the cavalry into distinct corps. This simple sentence describes an act of profound political and military genius. He shattered the ancient tribal levies. A chieftain no longer brought his men. He sent his men to the king, and the king decided their role. A man was no longer a warrior from the valley of Hamadan. He was now a spearman in the royal infantry or an archer in the Median bow corps. His loyalty was reforged, transferred from his local lord to his new unit, his new officers, and his king. He created a professional infantry, a corps of spearmen who were drilled to stand in a disciplined line, to hold their ground, to act as the steady, reliable anvil against which an enemy could be hammered. This was a direct answer to the Assyrian infantry, a necessary component for any army that planned to conduct a siege or fight a set-piece battle on a flat plain. He then created a distinct corps of archers, likely both foot archers, to man the siege lines, and critically, a new force of mounted archers, a direct imitation of the Scythian tactics that had so long terrorized his kingdom. He had, in essence, internalized the weapon of his former oppressor and made it his own. Finally, he reorganized the cavalry. The Medes were already the masters of the horse, but he refined this natural strength. He likely maintained the traditional heavy lancers of the Zagros, the shock cavalry, but now supported them with his new, lighter, Scythian-style horse archers. This new Median army was a synthesis, a hybrid monster built from the best of all worlds. It had the nomadic speed and lethality of the steppes, the disciplined combined arms structure of the Assyrians, and the high-altitude toughness and superior horsemanship of the Zagros. It was a professional, state-funded, and centrally commanded force, loyal to one man and his singular vision. This reorganization was more than a military reform. It was the final, crucial step in the creation of the Median state. The scattered potential of the Madai had been forged by Deioces into a kingdom occupied by the Scythians, and now reforged by Cyaxares into a true imperial weapon. This new army, the first of its kind in Iranian history, was now drilled, organized, and straining at the leash. It was a tool built for one specific, monumental task: to march west, to cross the Zagros, and to erase the city of Nineveh from the face of the earth. But Cyaxares, ever the cunning strategist, knew that even with this new weapon, a direct assault was a risk. He needed an ally, another rising power that hated Assyria as much as he did. His gaze turned south, down the Tigris River, to the ancient, resentful, and newly rebellious city of Babylon. Cyaxares, now master of a revolutionary new army, a hybrid force of disciplined infantry and Scythian-style horse archers, stood on the western edge of his mountain kingdom, gazing down toward the plains. He had forged a weapon capable of challenging Assyria, but the ghosts of his father's failed ambition counseled prudence. He had learned from Phraortes' disaster that to meet the Assyrian war machine on its own flat, open ground was still a terrible risk, even with his reformed military. He had also learned from his Scythian education that power respected power, and that the greatest victories were often won not by singular force, but by coordinated, overwhelming pressure. He would not march on Nineveh alone. He needed an ally, a second front, a partner in this grand, world-changing act of vengeance. And so, his messengers, bearing treaties and promises, rode not west, but south, down the great river valleys, toward the most ancient and resentful of all Assyria's subjects, the legendary city of Babylon. Babylon was a different kind of power entirely. It was not a nascent kingdom of highland tribes, but an ancient, cultured, and profoundly proud civilization that viewed the Assyrians as thuggish, northern usurpers. For centuries, Babylon had been the cultural and religious heart of Mesopotamia, but it had endured a long, brutal, and deeply humiliating subjugation. Assyrian kings had repeatedly marched south to crush its endemic rebellions, culminating in the horrific sack of the city by Sennacherib in 689 BCE, an act of such sacrilege he had destroyed the temples of the great god Marduk that it had shocked the known world. Now, in the dying decades of the 7th century, as Assyrian power was visibly cracking under the strain of internal revolts and the endless Scythian raids, Babylon was rising once more. A new, vigorous dynasty, the Chaldeans, had seized the throne, led by a cunning, patient, and ruthless general named Nabopolassar. Nabopolassar was, in many ways, the perfect lowland mirror to the highland Cyaxares. He was a brilliant strategist who had, like Cyaxares, forged a new national army from the wreckage of occupation. He had declared Babylonian independence and was methodically pushing the remaining Assyrian garrisons out of his territory, reclaiming the ancient cities of Sumer and Akkad one by one. But he, too, was reaching the limit of his own power. He could liberate Babylon, but he knew he could not, by himself, destroy the Assyrian heartland. The fortress cities of Ashur and Nineveh were still too strong, the Assyrian army still too formidable in its own territory. When the Median emissaries arrived at his court, proposing a formal alliance, Nabopolassar saw the key to unlocking his own imperial destiny. Here was a partner with a completely different, complementary military strength, a vast mobile force of cavalry and archers that could screen his own infantry, devastate the Assyrian countryside, and blockade the enemy capitals, while his own skilled engineers and foot soldiers, heirs to the ancient Mesopotamian art of siegecraft, could bring down the walls. This was not a vague agreement to fight a common foe. It was a precise, calculated, and revolutionary pact to dismember the world's first superpower and divide its corpse. And here, for the first time, we can step out of the legendary mists of Herodotus and onto the hard, dry clay of contemporary history. Archaeologists in the 19th century unearthed the Babylonian Chronicles, a series of cuneiform tablets that record the major events of this period from the Babylonian perspective, year by year. These chronicles, particularly the one known as the Fall of Nineveh Chronicle, are our most precious first-hand source for these events, and they confirm the alliance. The Babylonian scribe, in his cool, factual prose, speaks clearly of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, and his new ally, the Shar Umanmanda, the king of the Medes. The two monarchs, the tablets tell us, met, formalized their pact, and began to coordinate their military operations. The alliance was sealed, as was the custom for all high treaties of the age, not just with oaths to the gods, but with human blood. A dynastic marriage was arranged, a bond designed to tie the two new royal houses together for generations. The Greek historians, likely drawing from the Babylonian priest Berosus, tell us that Nabopolassar's son, the young brilliant crown prince, who would become the most famous ruler of his age, Nebuchadnezzar II, was married to a Median princess. Herodotus names her as Mandane, but this is likely a confusion. Berosus gives her name as Amytis, the daughter, or perhaps granddaughter, of Cyaxares. This marriage, this political union of a mountain princess and a desert plain prince, would become the seed of one of antiquity's greatest legends. It was for this Median wife, Amytis, homesick for the green, terraced slopes and cool, misty air of the Zagros, that Nebuchadnezzar would one day supposedly build the fabled Hanging Gardens of Babylon, a man-made mountain of trees and waterfalls rising from the flat, dusty city, a lasting romantic testament to the geopolitical pact that changed the world. With the pact sealed in blood and immortalized in clay tablets, the strategic plan was clear. It was a pincer movement on a continental scale. Nabopolassar's Babylonians would be the southern claw, advancing north up the Tigris River. Cyaxares' Medes would be the northern claw, sweeping west out of the Zagros. They would carve up the Assyrian Empire between them. The Medes, a highland people, would take the northern mountainous territories, the remnants of the kingdom of Urartu, around Lake Van, the high plains of northern Mesopotamia, and the eastern slopes of the Zagros. The Babylonians, a lowland river valley people, would take the rich, ancient heartland, the Fertile Crescent, lower Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, and the trade routes to the Mediterranean. The great lion of Assyria, weakened by internal decay and decades of war, was now trapped. The two greatest rising powers of the age, forged in the fires of resistance, their armies unified and their kings bound by marriage, were now poised at the border, ready to launch the final apocalyptic war. The objective was not subjugation, it was annihilation. The pact was sealed, the armies were marshaled, and the great pincer began to close. From the south, Nabopolassar of Babylon pushed north along the Tigris, a methodical, grinding advance, reclaiming the ancient cities of the Mesopotamian heartland. From the east, Cyaxares led his new, hybrid army of Median horsemen and disciplined infantry out of the Zagros, a mobile storm ready to envelop the Assyrian homeland. The year, as recorded in the precise dry prose of the Babylonian Chronicle, was 614 BCE, and the first target was the spiritual ancestral heart of the Assyrian Empire, the city of Ashur. This was not the political capital, but it was the home of their chief god, Ashur, the city from which the empire took its name. The Babylonians had marched north, but were repulsed. Then the chronicle notes, the Medes arrived. Cyaxares, moving with the speed that was his new hallmark, fell upon the city of Tarbasu near Nineveh, and then swept south to Ashur. He did what the Babylonians could not. He took the ancient holy city by storm, sacked it, and plundered its treasures. The Babylonian Chronicle states that Nabopolassar and his army, arriving too late for the battle, marched up the Tigris to Ashur. There, on the smoking ruins of the sacred city, the two kings finally met face to face. The text is simple and powerful. Nabopolassar and Cyaxares met one another by the city. They established mutual friendship and an alliance. This was the formal battlefield ratification of their pact, a handshake over the corpse of Assyria's past, sealing their intention to destroy its future. The next year was spent in smaller campaigns, consolidating their gains before they finally converged in 612 BCE on the true prize, the jewel and terror of the ancient world, the great city of Nineveh. Nineveh was not just a city, it was a monument to hubris, the largest and most magnificent fortress on earth. Built to a scale designed to awe and intimidate, its walls, built by Sennacherib, were over 7.5 miles in circumference, thick enough, it was said, for 3 chariots to ride abreast. 15 great fortified gates, named for the gods of the empire, guarded its approaches. Within those walls were vast irrigated parks, a zoo, temples, and the magnificent sprawling palace without rival, its walls lined with the infamous reliefs celebrating the flaying of rebels, the burning of cities, and the endless processions of tribute. Nineveh was the administrative brain, the military heart, and the psychological center of an empire that had dominated the world for 3 centuries. It was, thus in the minds of its inhabitants and its victims, invincible, and it was here that the Assyrian king, Sin-shar-ishkun, gathered the last remnants of the imperial army for a final, desperate stand. The Babylonian Chronicle describes the siege with a chilling economy of words. In the 14th year of Nabopolassar, the king of Akkad, Babylon, mustered his army, and the king of the Medes marched towards the king of Akkad. They encamped against Nineveh. For 3 long, grueling months, from May to July, the combined armies of Media and Babylonia laid waste to the city. This was the ultimate test of Cyaxares' new army and Nabopolassar's siegecraft. The Median horse archers, the Umanmanda, would have established a vast, lethal perimeter, dominating the surrounding plains, cutting off all supplies, and raining arrows on any defender who dared show himself on the massive battlements. Meanwhile, the Babylonian engineers, masters of their craft, would have pushed great siege towers, earthen ramps, and iron-tipped battering rams against the formidable gates and mud-brick walls, their infantry providing cover from behind massive curved shields. The siege was brutal, a relentless assault against a city fighting for its very existence. Later, Greek legends, attempting to explain the fall of such an impossibly strong fortress, would add a dramatic, elemental twist to the story. They claimed that the Tigris River, swollen with unusually heavy spring rains, flooded its banks and tore a great breach in the city's western wall, a divine intervention that allowed the attackers to pour in. While the Babylonian Chronicle does not mention this, archaeologists have indeed found evidence of significant flood damage and repair on the river-facing walls, lending a tantalizing kernel of truth to the legend. Whether by flood, by battering ram, or by a final desperate assault, the walls were breached. In the month of Abu, August, 612 BCE, the Allied armies burst into the great city. What followed was not a mere capture, it was an apocalypse. The city was given over to a systematic and vengeful slaughter. The Allies, their hearts hardened by centuries of Assyrian brutality, showed no mercy. The Babylonian Chronicle, usually so reserved, allows itself a moment of grim satisfaction. A great defeat they inflicted upon the people. They carried off the vast booty of the city and the temple. But its most terrifying final line is this: they turned the city into a mound of ruins and a heap of debris. This was not an exaggeration. Archaeologists excavating the great mound of Kuyunjik, the site of Nineveh, found a thick, distinct burn layer of ash and charcoal across the entire city, proof of a catastrophic fire. They found the skeletons of defenders, their weapons still in their hands, lying where they fell in the city's gateways. In the ruins of the great palaces, the colossal stone lamassu, the winged human-headed bulls that guarded the gates, were toppled, their faces deliberately smashed. The proud victory reliefs were shattered. The Medes and Babylonians were not just conquering a city, they were erasing a memory, destroying the very symbols of Assyrian power with a focused, iconoclastic rage. The king, Sin-shar-ishkun, vanished in the inferno, likely perishing in the flames of his own palace. The world had changed. The great shadow that had stretched from the Zagros to the Nile, the terror of the known world, had been extinguished in a single fiery storm. The fires of Nineveh smoldered for weeks, the thick, greasy smoke rising from the 7.5-mile circumference of its walls, a funeral pyre for an empire that had lasted 3 centuries. The great city, the palace without rival, was now, as the Babylonian Chronicle recorded, a mound of ruins and a heap of debris. In the Allied camps pitched on the ravaged plains, Median horsemen and Babylonian infantrymen, now comrades in this apocalyptic victory, began the long, slow process of sifting through the unimaginable plunder, the accumulated wealth of a plundered world. The great winged bulls that had guarded the gates lay shattered, their faces deliberately smashed, a final symbolic act of desecration against the very spirit of Assyrian power. The 2 chief architects of this new world, Cyaxares of Media and Nabopolassar of Babylon, met once more, not in a war council, but in a summit to draw the borders of a new age. The great pincer, having crushed its target, now formally and finally divided the world. This was not a complex, drawn-out negotiation. The terms had almost certainly been set in their initial pact, sealed by the marriage of Nebuchadnezzar and Amidus. The division was one of an elegant geographical logic. Nabopolassar, as the king of a lowland river valley civilization, claimed the ancient, settled, and fabulously wealthy lands of the Fertile Crescent. His new Babylonian Empire would inherit the Assyrian heartland, the great trade routes that ran along the Euphrates, and the entirety of Syria, Phoenicia, and Palestine, all the way to the border of Egypt. His destiny lay to the west and south, to control the ancient centers of commerce and culture, to become the new master of Mesopotamia and the Levant. His sphere was the plain, the river, and the sea. Cyaxares, in turn, claimed a dominion that mirrored his own origins. As the king of the High Zagros, he took the northern, eastern, and upland territories. His new Median Empire now stretched across the entire Iranian plateau, his mastery over the Persians and other tribes now absolute and unquestioned. He absorbed the Assyrian provinces in the northern mountains, and his territory now extended west, swallowing the remnants of the old kingdom of Urartu in Anatolia, pushing his border to the banks of the Halys River. His was an empire of the plateau, the mountain, and the high pasture. The world, which for so long had orbited a single, terrible center in Nineveh, now had two new gravitational poles, a dual system of power, Babylon in the south, Ecbatana in the east. But the work was not quite finished. An empire does not die in its capital. It dies on its last desperate battlefield. A small, stubborn remnant of the Assyrian army, led by a general who had declared himself King Ashur-uballit II, had managed to escape the inferno of Nineveh and had fled west to the city of Haran, a major center in Upper Mesopotamia. From here, they sent desperate pleas to the last great power in the region, Egypt. The Egyptian pharaoh, Necho the Stone, a shrewd and calculating ruler, saw the new Medo-Babylonian alliance not as a liberation, but as a terrifying new threat that had upset the entire balance of power. A resurgent Babylon, controlling the trade routes to the Levant, was a far greater danger to Egyptian interests than a dying Assyria. And so, in 610 BCE, Pharaoh Necho II marched his own army north, not to fight the Assyrians, but to save them, to prop up the rump state at Haran and maintain a crucial buffer between himself and Nabopolassar. The Babylonian Chronicle records these final, mopping-up campaigns with its usual precision. Nabopolassar and his new allies, the Medes, marched on Haran. The city fell, and Ashur-uballit II and his Egyptian patrons were forced to retreat. A final, decisive battle was fought at Carchemish in 605 BCE, where the Babylonian crown prince, Nebuchadnezzar, brilliantly commanding his father's army, utterly shattered the combined Egyptian-Assyrian force. This battle, famous in the biblical book of Jeremiah, marked the true, definitive end of Assyrian history and the undisputed ascendance of Babylon as the master of the West. Cyaxares and his Medes appear to have played a supporting role in these Western campaigns, assisting their ally in securing the New World Order, before turning their full attention to their own newly acquired sphere. Cyaxares returned to Ecbatana as the most powerful king his people had ever known. He was a liberator, an avenger, a reformer, and now an emperor. The plunder of Nineveh and Ashur, a river of gold, silver, bronze, and carved ivory, flowed back to his mountain capital, funding a new wave of monumental building, transforming the symbolic fortress of his grandfather into the true, wealthy capital of an empire. The Median problem, that old, stubborn tribalism, was now a distant memory, drowned in shared victory and unimaginable wealth. The Median state was now one of the four great superpowers of the New Age, standing equal to South Egypt, Chaldean Babylon, and a fourth, fabulously wealthy kingdom that now loomed on Cyaxares' new western border, the Kingdom of Lydia. With the East consolidated and the Assyrian threat erased from the earth, the relentless, expansive energy of the Median Empire, forged by Cyaxares, now had only one direction left to push: west into Anatolia, toward a collision with a power as rich and ambitious as his own. The world was now remade, its old, singular Assyrian center shattered and replaced by a new, polycentric order, a grand quartet of empires. In the south, Pharaoh Necho II ruled a resurgent Egypt from the Nile. In the Mesopotamian heartland, Nebuchadnezzar II, Cyaxares' ally and son-in-law, reigned over the opulent, scholarly, and powerful Neo-Babylonian Empire. In the east, Cyaxares himself commanded his vast, horse-rich Median domain from the high, cool fortress of Ecbatana. And now, on the newly drawn western frontier of that Median domain, where the high Iranian plateau flattens and descends into the rolling hills of Anatolia, Cyaxares' expansion had brought him face to face with the fourth great power of the age, the Kingdom of Lydia. His border was now the Halys River, the modern Kizilirmak, a winding reddish-brown barrier that cut through the center of what is now Turkey. On the far bank of that river lay the sphere of influence of a king as rich, as proud, and as ambitious as Cyaxares himself. This was the Lydian kingdom, ruled from its splendid, Acropolis-dominated capital of Sardis, a city that sat at the crossroads of the Aegean and the interior. The Lydians were a sophisticated, commercial, and formidable people governed by the powerful Mermnad dynasty, whose founder, Gyges, was a figure of legend. Their current king was Al-Yats, a shrewd and battle-hardened monarch who had consolidated his own empire in western Anatolia, subjugating the coastal Ionian Greeks and commanding a powerful, well-equipped army. But the Lydians were most famous for one thing above all else: gold. Their kingdom was blessed by the Pactolus River, a stream that flowed down from Mount Tmolus, carrying with it a fortune in electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver. The Lydians, in their genius for commerce, were credited by the Greeks as being the very first people to invent and use standardized struck coinage, a revolutionary technology that was transforming the nature of trade, tribute, and warfare in the ancient world. This was the power Cyaxares now faced, not a tribal confederation, not a collapsing ancient foe, but a modern, organized, and fabulously wealthy rival. A collision, it seems in retrospect, was inevitable. The expansive, restless energy of the newly forged Median Empire simply could not abide a static frontier, especially one that bordered such wealth. All that was needed was a spark, as a casus belli, and the ancient historians provide us with a story that is as dramatic as it is gruesome, a tale of revenge, flight, and diplomatic failure. Herodotus, our primary guide for this conflict, claims that the war began not with a border dispute, but with a band of Scythian mercenaries. He tells us that a group of these nomadic archers, who had lingered in the Median kingdom after the expulsion of their main horde, had entered the service of Cyaxares as royal hunters, tasked with keeping the palace supplied with wild game. On one occasion, they returned from the hunt empty-handed. Cyaxares, a man of famously harsh and volatile temper, the same man who had orchestrated the banquet massacre, flew into a rage and, as Herodotus puts it, treated them with the utmost contumely. The Scythians, a proud and ferocious people, did not absorb this insult. Their revenge was patient, calculating, and so horrific it became the stuff of legend. They decided to serve Cyaxares the very game he so desired. They took one of the Median boys, who served them as an apprentice, killed him, and then, in a chilling echo of the banquet Cyaxares himself had hosted, they dressed the flesh as they were wont to dress the animals, mingling the boy's remains with the other dishes. They served this terrible feast to the king and his unsuspecting court. As Cyaxares and his nobles ate, the Scythians slipped out of the hall, mounted their horses, and rode as fast as they could, not east or north, but west, making for the one place they knew Cyaxares could not easily reach them. They rode for the Halys River and threw themselves at the mercy of King Aliat of Lydia. The ruse was soon discovered, the nature of the feast revealed. The rage in Ecbatana must have been apocalyptic. Cyaxares immediately dispatched ambassadors to Sardis, his messengers crossing the river frontier and entering the Lydian capital with a single, non-negotiable demand. King Aliats must extradite the Scythian murderers immediately. They were Median subjects who had committed an unspeakable crime on Median soil. But Aliats, perhaps seeing these skilled nomadic warriors as a valuable military asset, or perhaps simply unwilling to bow to the dictates of a neighboring king, flatly refused to hand them over. This refusal was the final insult. The diplomatic breach was absolute. Cyaxares, in response, mustered his new formidable army and marched west, crossing the Halys River and invading the kingdom of Lydia. The year was approximately 590 BCE. This war, however, was not like the swift, decisive campaign against Nineveh. The Lydians were not a collapsing empire, they were a power at their absolute zenith. The conflict, Herodotus tells us, dragged on for 5 long, grueling years, with variable success. This was a clash of equals. The Median army, with its swarms of horse archers, was devastating in the open field, but the Lydian army was anchored by its own powerful heavy cavalry and disciplined infantry, well funded by the gold of the Pactolus and fighting to defend their homes. The war likely settled into a grinding, bloody stalemate, a series of seasonal campaigns that ravaged the central Anatolian plateau, with the Medes perhaps winning a battle one summer, only to be pushed back by a Lydian counteroffensive the next. Neither king could gain the decisive advantage. The two great empires, one of the mountain and one of the coast, were locked in a costly embrace, bleeding each other white on the high plains, with no end in sight. They were two irresistible forces, and the world waited to see which one would break, until in the 6th year of the war, the heavens themselves intervened. The stalemate had ground on for 5 exhausting years, a seasonal, bloody rhythm of raid and counter-raid that had turned the high plains of central Anatolia into a contested graveyard. In the 6th year of the war, 585 BCE, the two great kings, Cyaxares of Media and Aliats of Lydia, once again gathered their full imperial strength for what both hoped would be the final, decisive engagement. The armies drew up, likely on a wide plain near the Halys River, the very border they were fighting to control. On one side, the Median cavalry, the swift, Scythian-style horse archers, and the heavy lancers of the Zagros, a mobile eastern force. On the other, the gold-funded, disciplined infantry and the renowned heavy cavalry of Lydia, a western organized power. The signal was given, and the two great war machines of the New Age clashed, the air filling with the thunder of hooves, the high-pitched whistle of 1,000 arrows, and the percussive, jarring scream of metal on metal. The battle raged, Herodotus tells us, with equal advantage, neither side able to break the other, the field becoming slick with the blood of two empires, the outcome as uncertain as it had been for the past half-decade. Then, in the full heat of the afternoon, as the slaughter reached its peak, something impossible began to happen. The light, the very quality of the day, began to fail. A strange, sickly, yellowish-gray pallor washed over the battlefield, draining the color from the bronze shields and the scarlet banners. Soldiers, their arms weary from wielding spears, paused, looking up from the grim work of killing to the sky. The sun, that most constant, eternal, and life-giving of all deities, was being visibly eaten. A black, creeping shadow, a disk of perfect, terrifying night, began to slide across its face. The roar of battle faltered. The commands of officers died in their throats. The horses began to rear and snort in a primal, superstitious panic. This was not a cloud, not a sandstorm. This was the order of the cosmos unraveling. Within minutes, the midday sun, the symbol of Apollo to the Lydians, perhaps of Mithra to the Medes, was gone, completely blotted from the sky. A profound, unearthly twilight fell upon the field. The world was plunged into a cold, sudden darkness. Stars, unseen for months, pricked the black daytime sky. The corona of the sun, a ghostly, shimmering halo, was visible around the black moon, a sight of such profound, divine, and terrifying beauty that it shattered the mundane rage of the battle. For the common soldier, this was an unambiguous sign. This was the raw, immediate, and awesome intervention of the gods. They were clearly, incandescently, and terrifyingly displeased with this human conflict. To continue fighting, to strike another blow in this divinely imposed darkness, would be the highest form of sacrilege. Herodotus, in a simple, perfect line, states the reactions of both armies. When they saw the day turned into night, they ceased from fighting and were wondrously anxious, both of them, to make peace. The spears were dropped, the swords were sheathed, and the men who, moments before, had been trying to kill one another, now knelt on the blood-soaked earth, their faces turned to the sky in a shared, silent, and universal terror. This event, the Battle of the Eclipse, is one of the most secure and significant anchor points in all of ancient history. Modern astronomers, armed with the precise cycles of celestial mechanics, can retroactively calculate the path of such eclipses with pinpoint accuracy. They confirm that on May 28, 585 BCE, a total solar eclipse did indeed pass directly over the Halys River Valley, in the exact theater of the Lydian-Median War. Herodotus adds a fascinating, almost modern footnote to this miracle. He claims that the eclipse had been predicted. Thales of Miletus, one of the first of the great Ionian Greek philosophers, a Lydian subject himself from the coast, had, Herodotus says, forewarned the Ionians of it fixing for it the very year in which it took place. Thales, who had likely studied the astronomical records and mathematical cycles, the Saros cycles, captured by the Babylonians, had introduced a stunning new idea to the world, that the cosmos was not merely the whim of the gods, but a vast, predictable machine. For the kings, however, the message was simpler. The gods had commanded an end. Cyaxares and Alyattes, as shaken as their men, immediately called a truce. The momentum for war, so powerful just moments before, had evaporated completely. They needed mediators, neutral parties to solemnize this divinely ordained peace. Herodotus names them, and the names are telling. One was Cynesis III, the king of Cilicia, a buffer kingdom to the south. The other, critically, was Lebanitis of Babylon. This name, Lebanitis, is the Greek rendering of a Babylonian name, almost certainly Cyaxares' own powerful ally, King Nebuchadnezzar II. The presence of the Babylonian king, or his highest emissary, at this negotiation highlights the new, interconnected, and diplomatic world these powers had built. The treaty was swift. The war would end. The Halys River, the very line of control they had fought over, was now declared the permanent, inviolable border between the Median and Lydian spheres. And as was the ancient custom for all treaties of this magnitude, the peace was to be sealed in blood. A new dynastic marriage was arranged. Alyattes, king of Lydia, gave his daughter, Princess Arianis, to be the wife of Cyaxares' son and heir, the Median crown prince, Astyages. This is the very same Astyages we met in our first section, the king whose future dreams would set in motion the end of this entire story. His marriage to a Lydian princess now bound the Median royal house not only to the new power of Babylon, but to the old fabulous wealth of Sardis, creating a web of royal marriages that now spanned the three great non-Egyptian empires of the world. The unearthly darkness of the eclipse had lifted, revealing a battlefield transformed. The spears, moments before dedicated to slaughter, were now grounded, and the two most powerful armies of Anatolia stood in a shared, profound, and superstitious awe. The Battle of the Halys in 585 BCE had ended not with a victor, but with a divine arbitration, a clear message from the heavens that the cosmos itself demanded peace. The subsequent treaty, brokered by the kings of Babylon and Cilicia, was absolute. The Halys River was set as the permanent, sacred border, and the Median crown prince, Astyages, was bound in marriage to the Lydian princess, Arianis. This event, this sudden, celestial freezing of imperial expansion, marks the end of the Median war-making and the beginning of its brief, magnificent zenith. Cyaxares, the great revolutionary, the liberator who had avenged his father's death, the cunning host who had massacred the Scythians, the reformer who had rebuilt his army, the strategist who had annihilated Nineveh, and the warrior who had fought the Lydian gold to a standstill, could finally, in his last days, rule in peace. He returned to Ecbatana as the undisputed master of one of the three greatest empires on earth. The Median domain was now a colossal territory, the very first of the great Iranian empires, a highland superstate that dwarfed its sophisticated ancient neighbors. Its borders were now secure and defined by clear natural boundaries and powerful allied buffer states. In the west, the Halys River separated Media from the Lydian kingdom of Alyattes, now a formal ally and in-law. In the south, the plains of Mesopotamia were held by the mighty Neo-Babylonian Empire, ruled by Cyaxares' partner and son-in-law Nebuchadnezzar II. To the east, the Median dominion stretched out across the vast, high Iranian plateau, its influence extending over the Parthians, the Bactrians, and perhaps as far as the fringes of India, a vast hinterland that was the source of trade and exotic goods. In the north, it had absorbed the old mountainous kingdom of Urartu, and critically, to the southwest, the Persians of Anshan, kinsmen and fellow Iranians, were its loyal and most powerful vassals, their own royal line, the Achaemenids, paying homage to the Median king of kings. This vast new security, combined with the unimaginable tide of plunder that had flowed from the sacked Assyrian capitals, transformed the Median world. Ecbatana, the fortress of Deioces, now blossomed into a true imperial capital. The legend of the seven-colored walls, culminating in silver and gold, no longer seems quite so fantastic if we understand it as a metaphor for the city's new role as the center of a wealthy, multi-ethnic empire. Tribute now flowed in organized streams. The magnificent Nisaean horses, the primary currency of Median power, vast quantities of metal, iron from the Zagros, copper, and the vital tin from the east needed for bronze making, timber, grain, and textiles, and the deep blue celestial lapis lazuli, which made the long, protected journey from the distant mines of Afghanistan. The capital, nestled in its high, cool plain, became a cosmopolitan center, a meeting place for Median nobles, vassal chieftains, Babylonian diplomats, Lydian merchants, and perhaps even the first Ionian Greek artists and thinkers, drawn by the new wealth. How this empire was governed is one of the great open questions of Median history. It was almost certainly not the centralized bureaucratic state the Persians would later perfect. There were no satraps in the Achaemenid sense. Instead, Cyaxares and his son Astyages likely ruled through a sophisticated vassal system, a feudal structure that was the hallmark of many highland, horse-based societies. The King of Kings sat at the center in Ecbatana, and the local rulers, like the Persian king in Anshan or the various chieftains of the Armenian highlands, retained their local power, their thrones, and their customs. In return, they owed the Median monarch unwavering loyalty, annual tribute, and most importantly, military service, bound to appear with their personal levies when the great king called. This light-touch style of rule, this granting of significant local autonomy, was what kept the vast, geographically fractured empire together, but it was also its single greatest structural weakness. We have no Median literature, no royal inscriptions to tell us their own story. We see their culture only through two distorting mirrors. The first is the Greek lens. Historians like Herodotus and later Xenophon viewed the Medes as the inventors of imperial luxury, the soft, decadent originators of the very pomp the Persians would later adopt. They described the Median court dress, the long, flowing, brightly colored robes, the kandys, the high tiaras, the use of cosmetics, and the complex ceremonial etiquette of the court, the same manufactured remoteness that Deioces had supposedly invented. The Persians, when they took power, did not destroy this culture. They adopted it wholesale, viewing it as the proper, sophisticated trapping of imperial majesty. The second lens is archaeology, which gives us a more tangible, if fragmented, picture. At sites like Tepe Nushijan, a fortified manor and fire temple abandoned abruptly around 600 BCE, we find the very foundations of this culture. The architecture, with its tall, windowless columns and arrow slot defensive niches, is stark and powerful. This site, a high, lonely place of worship, provides us with one of our most profound clues to Median culture, their religion. The Magids, the powerful priestly caste who interpreted Astyages' dreams, were a Median tribe. It was the Medes who likely championed the emerging faith of Zoroastrianism with its dualistic worldview, its reverence for the natural elements, and its central worship of fire, Ahura Mazda's symbol of truth. The fire temple at Nushijan is, to date, the earliest known structure of its kind on the entire Iranian plateau. At its zenith, the Median Empire was the vessel for this new, ethical, and revolutionary faith, spreading it across the Iranian world. This, then, was the Median zenith. It was a brief, high summer, lasting only from the Battle of the Eclipse in 585 BCE to the fall of the empire in 550 BCE. It was a period of unrivaled power, wealth, and cultural transmission, a world held in a delicate, stable balance by three great, allied, intermarried royal houses. Shortly after the Lydian peace, the great king Cyaxares, the architect of this entire age, died, leaving this vast, peaceful, and glorious empire to his son, Astyages. It was an inheritance of almost unimaginable scale, a kingdom that seemed, for one shining moment, to be the permanent final masters of Asia. The great Cyaxares, liberator, reformer, and conqueror, was laid to rest. His tomb likely a magnificent monument in the mountains he had secured, his spirit joining the ancestors he had so thoroughly avenged. The Median Empire, a vast, peaceful, and seemingly unassailable dominion, passed in the year 585 BCE, just after the Lydian peace, to his son Astyages. This new king, the fourth and final monarch of the Herodotan dynasty, inherited a world that his grandfather, Deioces, could only have dreamed of. He was not a warrior king, forged in the fires of occupation and liberation like his father. He was an heir, a prince of the purple, born to a world where Median power was the established, central fact of Asia. His diplomatic and familial connections were unmatched. His sister, or perhaps aunt, was Amidus, the queen of Babylon, and his own wife, Arian Is, was the princess of the fabulously wealthy Lydian kingdom. The three great powers of the world were not rivals, but relatives, their thrones bound by the sacred diplomatic ties of his own blood. For 35 years, Astyages reigned from the high, cool, and now opulent capital of Ecbatana. This long, stable reign should, by all accounts, be remembered as the high summer of Median glory, a golden age of peace and prosperity. And yet, the portrait of Astyages that has been preserved for us, painted almost exclusively by Greek historians like Herodotus, is not one of a wise and steady statesman. It is a portrait of a classic Oriental despot, a figure defined by the very qualities that Greek philosophy found most alarming: decadence, paranoia, and a terrifying arbitrary cruelty. We have no Median or Persian royal inscriptions from this period to counter this narrative, no voice from Ecbatana itself. We see the last king of the Medes only through the eyes of his eventual conqueror's subjects, who, looking back, crafted a moralizing tale to explain the sudden, shocking collapse of so great an empire. In this Greek telling, Astyages was the living embodiment of the luxury that the hardy, mountain-dwelling Persians would later claim to despise, even as they enthusiastically adopted it. He was a man of the court, not the camp. His power was expressed not on the battlefield, but in the intricate, stifling, and almost religious ceremony of his palace. He was seen, robed in the flowing purple candies, his face, according to sources like Xenophon, painted with cosmetics, his eyes lined, his hair in elaborate artificial curls. He ruled as his grandfather Deioces had decreed, from a remote distance, surrounded by a hierarchy of whispering courtiers, servants, and eunuchs, a system designed to inspire awe, but which in this later telling is presented as a sign of effeminate softness and detachment from the real world. He was, in this portrait, a king who had forgotten the hard, high-altitude virtues of the Zagros, a man who had succumbed to the enervating, lowland luxuries that empires bring. But more dangerous than this supposed decadence was his character. Where Cyaxares was a sharp, calculating strategist, Astyages is painted as a man of volatile, unpredictable moods, a ruler whose power was absolute and whose temper was lethal. He was a king who commanded not through the fierce loyalty his father had earned, but through a cold, pervasive fear. This is the crucial element, the psychological flaw that the story of his downfall requires. A king so cruel, so arbitrary, so quick to inflict unimaginable punishments for the slightest failure, could not command the love of his subjects. He could only command their obedience, an obedience that was brittle, resentful, and in the end treacherous. This portrayal, of course, serves a profound narrative purpose. It provides the motive for the grand betrayal that is to come. A just and beloved king is not overthrown by his own court. A cruel and decadent tyrant, however, is simply reaping what he has sown. We are left with a historical contradiction, the image of a weak, cruel, and decadent ruler on the one hand, and the hard historical fact of a 35-year reign, one of the longest and most stable in the entire ancient Near East, on the other. It is a reign of complete external peace, a period where the Median Empire was at its absolute, undisputed zenith. How do we reconcile these two pictures? It is entirely possible, and indeed likely, that the Greek portrait is a caricature, a piece of post-facto propaganda, a simplistic, moralizing tale of hard versus soft peoples, of the virtuous, rustic Persian versus the decadent, corrupted Mede. Astyages may well have been a perfectly conventional, effective, and typically autocratic ruler for his time, a king who governed a vast and complex empire with a firm, traditional hand. His cruelty may have been nothing more than the standard, brutal justice of the age, and his decadence nothing more than the expected, necessary pomp of imperial majesty. But history, as it is remembered, is not always what was, but what was told. And the story that was told about Astyages, the story that survived, was one of a man fated to be destroyed, a man whose own actions, born of paranoia, would bring about the very doom he sought to avoid. For all his apparent stability, for all the security of his alliances, this long-reigning king was not, in his own mind, at peace. He was a man haunted by the gods, a man who listened with dreadful, literal intent to the whispers and portents that came to him in the dead of night. His long, stable reign was, in fact, the quiet winding up of a great prophetic clock, and Astyages himself, secure against the entire world, was about to be undone by a simple, terrifying dream about his own daughter. It was in the midst of this long, opulent, and outwardly stable reign that the first subtle crack appeared, not in the mountain walls of the empire, but in the sleeping mind of the king himself. Astyages, the ruler of a domain at peace, secured by marriage alliances with the two other great powers of the world, became a man haunted by his own bloodline. The story that will now unfold is the one we glimpsed in our very first moments together, the prophecy of the child, but now we return to it, not as a prologue, but as the true chronological beginning of the end. Astyages had a daughter named Mandane. Herodotus, our primary source for this intimate royal drama, does not tell us who her mother was, whether she was the child of the Lydian princess Arianis or another of the king's wives. But she was, regardless, the direct vessel of the royal bloodline, and it was upon her that the king's anxieties and the anxieties of the gods now focused. One night, in the deep, fire-warmed silence of the palace at Ecbatana, Astyages dreamt a vision of profound and disturbing symbolism. He dreamt that his daughter, Mandane, urinated, and that the water which flowed from her was not a stream, but a deluge. It became a great, swelling river that rose to engulf his capital, and then kept rising, pouring over the Zagros, flooding the plains, until the entirety of Asia was submerged beneath a vast, dark, and churning sea. He awoke in the pre-dawn cold, the vision clinging to him, its physiological impossibility only heightening its supernatural dread. He did as his ancestors had always done. He summoned the sacred interpreters, the Magi, that priestly Median tribe who were masters of divination, the men who read the future in dreams, in the flight of birds, and in the patterns of the sacrificial flame. The Magi, their faces grim in the torchlight of the audience hall, conferred and returned to the king with an interpretation that was unambiguous and terrifying. The dream, they explained, was a direct portent. The offspring of his daughter, Mandane, would one day rise up and usurp his throne. The flood was his kingdom, and her child would be the one to overwhelm it, drowning the Median dynasty and ruling in his stead. Astyages, a man steeped in the superstitions of his age, did not doubt the prophecy for a moment. But he was a king, and he believed, as kings often do, that destiny could be managed, that a divine decree could be cleverly, politically outwitted. He would not harm his daughter, but he would neutralize her. The greatest threat would be if Mandane were married to a high-ranking Median noble, a man of power and ambition from one of the great Zagros clans, who might use the prophecy as a banner for his own rebellion. Astyages, in a move of what he believed was profound cunning, decided to marry his daughter down. He would not give her to any Mede. Instead, he looked to his vassals, to the subordinate secondary peoples who paid him tribute. His gaze fell upon the Persians of Anshan, his kinsmen to the south, a people he considered hardy and well-born, but crucially, politically placid and lacking in imperial ambition. He chose from their nobility a man named Cambyses, a man of the Achaemenid royal line, but one whom Astyages had personally judged to be of a quiet and gentle disposition, a man utterly lacking the mettle for a coup. He gave Mandane in marriage to this Persian noble and sent her away from the high court of Ecbatana down to the rustic provincial life of Anshan, believing he had exiled the prophecy with her. The threat, he was sure, was contained. Time passed, a year or two perhaps. Mandane, in her new home, became pregnant, and back in Ecbatana, Astyages dreamt again. This second dream was even more vivid, but more potent, more elemental. He dreamt that from his daughter's womb there grew a great and supernatural vine. Its tendrils snaked out, its branches twisting and climbing with an unstoppable, miraculous vitality. It grew up the slopes of the Zagros. It covered the plains of Mesopotamia. Its leaves cast a deep, cool shadow over the hot sands of Syria, and its branches reached west, climbing over the mountains of Lydia, until, just as in the first dream, the entirety of Asia was covered by its shade. The king awoke, not just in fear, but in a cold fury. He had been tricked, or the gods were relentless. He summoned the Magi a second time. Their interpretation was now even more urgent. The first dream had been a warning. The second was a confirmation. The child now growing inside Mandane was the branch, the usurper, the shadow that would cover the world. This time, Astyages would not rely on political calculation. His solution would be absolute. He dispatched messengers to Anshan, bearing a royal and seemingly kind summons. He told his daughter, Mandane, that he wished for her to return to the capital, to be with her family, so that he, the king, could be present for the birth of his first grandchild. Mandane, suspecting nothing, obeyed. She made the long, arduous journey back over the mountains, back to the seven-walled city, and there, within the very fortress of the man who planned its destruction, she gave birth to a healthy, royal son. Astyages looked upon the infant, the product of his own blood and his deepest fears, and his heart was hardened. The prophecy was now manifest, a small, breathing, helpless reality. He waited only a few days, and then he summoned the one man in the entire empire whose loyalty, he believed, was absolute, a kinsman and courtier named Harpagus, who served as his most trusted general and grand vizier. He placed the infant, wrapped in its royal blankets, into Harpagus's arms and gave him a simple, chilling order. Take the child away, ensure its death, and see to it that it was buried, far from the eyes of the court. Harpagus, the king's most trusted vizier, a man whose life and fortune were bound to the throne, walked from the royal audience hall with the newborn, royal infant in his arms. The child was the king's own grandson, wrapped in blankets that smelled of the court, and the order was unambiguous. This child was to be exposed, his life extinguished by the cold mountain wind, his existence erased to satisfy a prophecy. Harpagus returned to his own, wealthy home within the fortress, his mind a vortex of terrible, conflicting loyalties. He was a kinsman to Astyages, but he was also a man of the court, a political creature. He sat by his hearth, the infant stirring in his lap, and weighed the consequences. To disobey his king, a man of such known and volatile cruelty, was to invite his own certain and agonizing death. But to obey, to murder with his own hands a child of the royal bloodline, the son of Mandane, was an act of profound, polluting sacrilege. And his calculating mind whispered, what if the prophecy was true regardless? What if somehow Mandane or another of her line came to the throne? She would surely hunt down the man who had actually murdered her firstborn son. Harpagus, caught between the immediate terror of his king and the potential future vengeance of the princess, chose a third bureaucratic path. He would obey the letter of the law, but he would not stain his own hands with the act. He summoned not a soldier or a courtier, but one of the king's royal herdsmen, a man named Mithridates, whose flocks grazed on the wild, remote, and wolf-haunted mountainsides far to the north of Ecbatana, a place perfectly suited for an infant's accidental death. He placed the child, still in its fine royal wrappings, into the herdsman's rough hands. Harpagus was stern, his voice devoid of emotion. He commanded the herdsman to take the child, to lay it in the most desolate part of the hills, where it may be sure to die the quickest. He bound the herdsman's loyalty with the king's own terror, threatening him with the most miserable of deaths if he should fail, or if he should, by any means, attempt to save the child. Mithridates, a simple man terrified by the high, cold plotting of the court, bowed and took the infant, leaving the city for his long trek back to the mountains. The herdsman returned to his small stone cottage on the mountainside, the child's silent, royal burden heavy in his arms, his mind set on the grim task. But as he entered his own home, he was met not with his wife's usual greeting, but with the sound of her fresh, agonized wailing. He found his wife, whose median name was Spako, crouched by their own hearth, grieving. She too had just given birth, but her own son, the child of the mountains, had been born dead. The cottage was filled with the double sorrow of a king's terrible command and a peasant's private loss. As Spako wept, her husband laid down the living royal child. She saw the fine linen, the healthy limbs, the face of the infant. And when her husband told her the story, the king's order, the threat, the prophecy, a new, desperate, and brilliant idea formed in her grief. She threw her arms around her husband's knees, begging him not to expose the child. "Since my own child is dead," she pleaded, "let us take this one. Let us dress my stillborn son in the rich clothing of the prince, and let him be the one exposed. We can raise this one as our own. The king's men will see a dead child, and we will have saved a life and gained a son." Mithridates, seeing the wisdom and the mercy in his wife's plan, agreed. They made the exchange. The small, cold body of the herdsman's son was wrapped in the prince's swaddling, and the living royal infant, now named Cyrus, was taken to Spako's breast. Mithridates carried his own dead son to the most desolate part of the mountain, just as Harpagus had ordered, and left him there. A few days later, he reported back to the city, telling Harpagus the child was dead. Harpagus, needing to be certain, dispatched his most trusted guards to the mountain. They saw the small, unmoving bundle, the fine clothes, the work of the wolves, and the cold. They confirmed its death, and the body was buried. Harpagus, his hands now technically clean, reported the successful execution of the order to King Astyages. The king, his great fear finally put to rest, the prophecy averted, returned to the opulent, peaceful routine of his long reign, the matter of his grandson now a forgotten, buried secret. 10 years passed. The boy, Cyrus, grew up in the mountain air, a child of impossible vigor, strength, and a natural unnerving charisma. He believed himself to be the son of the herdsman Mithridates. One day in the village, he was playing a game of king and court with the other boys. By natural, unspoken consent, Cyrus was chosen to be the king. One of his subjects in the game, the son of a high-ranking Median nobleman named Artembaris, refused to obey one of his royal commands. Cyrus, in a fit of absolute innate authority, ordered the boy seized by the other children and had him severely whipped. The nobleman's son ran home, bleeding and humiliated, to his father. Artembaris, incandescent with rage that a mere herdsman's slave boy had dared to lay hands on his son, stormed to Ecbatana and demanded justice from King Astyages, bringing Cyrus before the throne as proof of the outrage. Astyages, seated on his throne, looked down at the 10-year-old boy. He asked him how he, a herdsman's son, could dare to treat the son of a noble in such a way. Cyrus, Herodotus tells us, was not afraid. He stood before the king, his gaze level, and answered with a clear royal logic. "My lord, I did to him as was fitting. The boys of the village, of whom he was one, chose me as their king in their play. He would not obey my commands. For that he received his punishment. If I am worthy of blame, here I am." Astyages was struck dumb. The boy's face, the flash of his eyes, the unmistakable arrogant cast of his features, it was, he realized with a dawning, icy horror, the face of his own family. He calculated the boy's age, 10 years. He looked at the herdsman. His rage turned to a cold, terrible suspicion. He dismissed Artembares, promising him justice, and took the herdsman and the boy into his private chambers. Under the threat of torture, the terrified Mithridates confessed everything: the stillborn child, the swap, the wife's plea. The king's rage was now absolute, but it was not directed at the herdsman, who had merely acted out of pity. It was for Harpagus. Harpagus, his most trusted vizier, his kinsman, had betrayed him, had allowed the prophecy to live. He summoned Harpagus, who upon seeing the herdsman knew his secret was undone, and he too confessed, begging for mercy. Astyages' reply was a masterpiece of chilling psychological torture. He feigned a sudden, joyful relief. He told Harpagus that all was forgiven, that he was overjoyed his grandson was, in fact, alive, and that the gods had set things right. He announced a great celebratory feast to honor the boy's return. "Go home," the king told Harpagus, "and send your own son, a boy of about 13, to the palace to be a companion for my newfound grandson. And then come yourself and dine with me." Harpagus, overwhelmed with relief, bowed and rushed home, immediately sending his only son, his beloved heir, to the palace. That evening, Harpagus attended the royal feast. He was seated at a high table, and Astyages, smiling and gracious, served him from a special covered dish, a great honor. Harpagus ate his fill of the savory, roasted meat. When the meal was finished, Astyages leaned forward, his voice a soft, polite query, asking Harpagus if he had enjoyed the dish. Harpagus, suspecting nothing, replied that he had. The king then signaled to his guards, who brought forth another covered dish and placed it before Harpagus. They lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a silver platter, were the freshly severed head, hands, and feet of a child. Astyages asked, in that same soft voice, if Harpagus now knew what beast he had been feasting upon. Harpagus, his world collapsing in a single, unbreathable moment, looked at the small, familiar features. He had been tricked into eating the dismembered body of his own son. In this moment, Herodotus says, Harpagus revealed his own terrible greatness. He did not scream, he did not faint, he did not lunge at the king. He simply looked at the remains, his face a mask of iron, and replied, "I know, my king, and whatever the king does is pleasing." He gathered the remains, was given leave to go, and walked, not ran, from the palace. From that night, his heart contained only two things: the ashes of his son and a cold, patient, long-simmering desire for revenge so complete it would salt the very earth of the Median dynasty. He had his enemy, King Astyages, and now he hid his weapon, the boy, Cyrus. The air in the great feasting hall of Ecbatana grew thick and cold, heavy with the unspeakable silence of Harpagus' grief. He had gathered the grisly, severed remains of his only son, his face an iron mask of perfect, chilling submission, and had walked from the palace a man hollowed out, a walking tomb. King Astyages, having exacted his perfect, monstrous revenge, now believed the matter was settled. He had punished the disloyal, and his power was once again absolute. But there remained the small, lingering problem of the boy, Cyrus. The king, having looked into his grandson's eyes and seen the unmistakable, unnerving spark of his own royal blood, could no longer simply ignore him. The child, now 10 years old, was a living, breathing prophecy, and the king's fear, which had been put to rest by Harpagus' lie, now returned with a cold, renewed grip. He summoned the Magi once more, the same priests who had interpreted his dreams of the flood and the vine, and laid the entire strange story before them. He told them of the boy's discovery, his innate authority, and the game of king in the village that had led to his unmasking. The Majas, listening in the deep silence of the throne room, considered this new information. Their faces, which had once shown such grim certainty, now relaxed. They conferred and then delivered to the king a new and profoundly relieving interpretation. The prophecy, they declared, had been fulfilled, but it had fulfilled itself in the weakest, most harmless possible way. The boy, they explained, had become a king. He had been acclaimed king by the other children in their play. He had worn the crown of their game, and he had issued royal commands and punishments. The gods, they argued, were often literal and economical in their portents. The dream had been satisfied by this small, symbolic childhood act. The grand destiny had been discharged in a harmless game. "Be of good cheer, O king," they likely told him. "The boy has been a king. The dream is spent. You have no more to fear from him." For Astyages, this was a perfect, elegant solution. It satisfied his superstition, quieted his paranoia, and most importantly, it absolved him of the need to commit a second, far more dangerous act of kinslaying against a 10-year-old boy who was now widely known to be his grandson. Joyful and deeply relieved, Astyages declared the matter closed. He called the boy Cyrus before him, and for the first time likely acknowledged him as his kin. He then did what he believed was the final, prudent act. He sent the boy away from the Median court, away from the center of power, dispatching him south to Anshan to be delivered at last to his true biological parents, the quiet Persian vassal Cambyses and the king's own daughter Mandane. Cyrus, the boy raised in a herdsman's cottage, who had been king of the village, now traveled south to learn that he was, in fact, a prince, the heir to the vassal throne of the Persians, but still and always a subject of his grandfather, the great king in Ecbatana. Years, then decades, passed. Cyrus grew to manhood in the Persian heartland, a world far removed from the high cosmopolitan luxury of Ecbatana. He was raised as a Persian nobleman, skilled in the hard, rustic virtues his people prized: to ride, to draw the bow, and, as Herodotus famously noted, to speak the truth. He was now a prince of a subject people, acutely aware of his dual heritage, the royal blood of Media from his mother, the vassal lord's blood of Persia from his father. He was, in all likelihood, a charismatic, ambitious, and deeply compelling figure, a man who inspired a fierce, almost religious loyalty in those around him. And all this time, he was being watched. Back in Ecbatana, Harpagus, the man who had eaten his own son, continued to serve his king. He was the perfect courtier, his loyalty impeccable, his advice sound, his submission at absolute. But beneath this placid scar tissue surface, his desire for revenge had not faded. It had cooled, hardened, and waited. It was a long, slow, patient investment in pure hatred. He watched Astyages grow older, perhaps more complacent, his rule growing ever more arbitrary. And he watched the young Persian prince, Cyrus, grow into a formidable man. Harpagus, holding his high position in the Median court, began a long, delicate, and treasonous correspondence. He began to cultivate the other Median nobles, the powerful chieftains of the Zagros, many of whom had also suffered under Astyages' cruelty and arrogance, and who resented the king's detachment. He fanned their discontents in secret, reminding them of the king's insults, preparing them for a change. Then, when the time was right, Harpagus sent his first, decisive message to Cyrus. He needed to communicate his entire, complex plan of treason, a message so dangerous that its interception would mean the agonizing death of everyone involved. Herodotus describes the method, a moment of pure folkloric spycraft. Harpagus, a keen hunter, took a hare, one of the fastest animals of the plains. He carefully slit open its belly, wrote his message on a small strip of parchment, and sewed the letter deep inside the animal's fresh carcass. He then stitched the hare back up, making it appear whole. He gave this game to his most trusted messenger, disguised as a hunter carrying his day's catch, and sent him on the long, high-risk journey south to Anshan. The messenger was instructed to deliver the hare only to Cyrus himself, and to tell the prince by word of mouth to cut it open with his own hand when no one is looking. Cyrus, his curiosity piqued, did as he was told. In the privacy of his chambers, he opened the hare and found the letter. It was the moment Harpagus had been waiting 30 years to write. The letter detailed everything: Astyages' tyranny, the deep discontent of the Median nobility, and a direct, electrifying command. "The gods are with you," Harpagus wrote. "Rally the Persian people. March north against your grandfather. I and all the other nobles who hate him will be there to greet you. I have been appointed general, and the moment the battle is joined, I will be the first to defect, and I will bring the entire Median army with me. The throne is yours." Cyrus now held in his hand the key to the prophecy, the mechanism of his destiny. He had his own ambition, the love of his Persian people, a divine mandate, and now the guaranteed treasonous support of his enemy's single, most powerful general. He did not hesitate. He summoned the various scattered Persian tribes to a great assembly using a clever stratagem. On the first day, he commanded them to clear a vast, thorny field with their bare hands, a day of brutal, grinding, humiliating labor. On the second day, he had that same field set for a magnificent feast, slaughtering his father's herds, providing endless wine, and inviting them to revel. As they celebrated, he asked them, "Which day did you prefer, the day of toil or the day of feasting?" When they roared, "The day of feasting," Cyrus, his voice ringing with the authority Astyages had glimpsed 10 years prior, gave them their choice. "If you follow me," he declared, "you will have days like this and countless other blessings, free from all toil. But if you do not, you will have endless, back-breaking labor like yesterday." He was offering them a choice between servitude to Media and freedom as the masters of their own destiny. The Persians, fired by his charisma and his promise, rose as one. They declared him their king, not a vassal, but their true independent ruler. The great Persian revolt had begun. The news of the Persian revolt, when it finally reached the high, cool halls of Ecbatana, must have struck King Astyages not as a mortal threat, but as a profound, personal, and deeply impudent insult. This was not a foreign power, not a Lydian or Babylonian rival. This was his own vassal, his own kinsman, the boy he had personally spared and sent south, the son of the quiet and gentle Cambyses. His 35-year reign had been one of such profound external peace, such unchallenged domestic authority, that the concept of a serious internal rebellion was almost unthinkable. His first reaction, Herodotus tells us, was one of pure, arrogant, and fatal miscalculation. He was a king who had forgotten that the prophecies of the gods, unlike the loyalties of men, do not bend to convenience or fade with time. In his rage, he sneered that Cyrus would have no joy of his rebellion, and that he would make the boy regret his impudence. His first terrifying act of spite was not military, but personal. He summoned the Magi, the very priests who 10 years prior had so confidently assured him that the prophecy was spent, that the boy king of the village game was a harmless, symbolic fulfillment. Now, seeing the prophecy roaring back to life as a full-blown military insurrection, Astyages was incandescent with fury. He had been given false counsel, his fears had been improperly allayed. He ordered the Magi who had misinterpreted the dream to be seized, and in a fit of the arbitrary cruelty for which he was feared, had them impaled. He then turned to the military practicalities, his mind clouded by the same blinding arrogance. He needed a general to lead the Median imperial army, to march south, to crush this provincial uprising, and to drag his insolent grandson back to Ecbatana in chains. And in this moment, his rage made him forget 30 years of simmering, silent hatred. He made the single, catastrophic, and poetically perfect mistake. He appointed, as the commander-in-chief of his entire loyalist force, the one man in the world who had been patiently, meticulously planning his destruction, Harpagus. Harpagus, the man who had carried the ashes of his murdered son in his heart for decades, received the royal commission with the same perfect, iron-masked submission he had shown at the cannibal feast. He bowed, accepted the command, and marched the great Median army out of the capital, the full professional force of spearmen, archers, and cavalry that Cyaxares had forged, to meet the nascent tribal army of the Persians. The two forces met in open battle, and the result was exactly as Harpagus had promised in his secret letter. The moment the battle was joined, Harpagus and the powerful contingent of Median nobles whom he had cultivated in his conspiracy, the men who, Herodotus says, were aggrieved at the savage cruelty of Astyages, gave the signal. They did not just retreat, they turned. They and their entire divisions, the very core of the Median professional army, defected en masse to the Persian side, turning their weapons on the few, bewildered loyalist regiments that remained. The battle was not a battle. It was a handover. The imperial army simply melted away, its leadership and its heart now firmly pledged to Cyrus. When the news of this colossal, almost unimaginable betrayal reached Astyages in Ecbatana, his rage became a kind of madness. He had been undone by the two men he had wronged most, the grandson he had tried to kill, and the courtier whose son he had murdered and served as food. But the king, for all his decadent portrayal, was not a physical coward. He was the son of Cyaxares, and he would not surrender his kingdom. He was, Herodotus says, bereft of his army by his own fault, but he would not be bereft of his crown. He did what all last desperate kings do. He armed the home guard. He issued a new decree, a levée en masse, calling up every Mede who remained in the capital, the old men and the boys, the palace guard, the servants, any man, young or old, who could still hold a spear. He formed this last motley and deeply reluctant army, and in a final doomed act of royal defiance, he personally led them out of the city gates to confront his grandson. The final confrontation was short, brutal, and inevitable. Cyrus, his Persian forces, now massively swollen by the professional, battle-hardened troops of Harpagus' defectors, met his grandfather's home guard. The old men and boys of Ecbatana, fighting not out of loyalty but out of fear of their king, were no match for the combined eager forces of the revolution. They broke and they fled, and Astyages, the last king of the Medes, was surrounded and taken alive. The year was 550 BCE. Cyrus, the prophesied child, the herdsman's boy, the provincial prince, was now the undisputed master of Media. He marched his army back to the capital, not as a raider, but as its new, legitimate ruler. And here we see the profound difference between the old world and the new. When Cyaxares, Cyrus's great-grandfather, had taken Nineveh, he had annihilated it. He had turned it into a mound of ruins, satisfying centuries of hatred. But when Cyrus took Ecbatana, his own grandfather's capital, he showed a revolutionary and deeply political clemency. The city was not sacked, the palaces were not burned, the people were not slaughtered. This was not a foreign conquest. It was a dynastic transfer of power, a regime change. Cyrus, as the son of Mandane, the Median princess, had a legitimate claim to this throne. He was not destroying Media, he was absorbing it. He entered the magnificent seven-walled city, took possession of the vast imperial treasury, the plunder of Assyria, the tribute of the plateau, and in a final symbolic act, he claimed the Median royal robes and the complex court ceremony as his own. Ecbatana, the glittering capital of the Medes, was not to be a ruin. It was to be the first and most important capital of his new united Medo-Persian Empire. As for Astyages, Cyrus spared his life. His grandfather, the man who had tried to murder him, was kept in honorable, comfortable confinement. The prophecy was fulfilled. The vine had, indeed, overshadowed all of Asia. And for Harpagus, his long, cold, 30-year wait was over. His revenge was complete, not in the hot blood of a single murder, but in the cold, permanent, and absolute political destruction of his enemy's entire world. The great high-walled city of Ecbatana, which had been the glittering, seven-ringed symbol of Median power, now lay quiet, its gates open, its new master within its walls. The year was 550 BCE, and Cyrus, the prophesied child of the herdsman's cottage, was in full possession of his grandfather's throne. But in this moment of supreme dynastic victory, Cyrus revealed the revolutionary quality of his genius, a political acumen that would define his entire reign and set his new empire on a course unlike any that had come before. His great-grandfather, Cyaxares, had celebrated his own foundational victory at Nineveh by turning the city into a mound of ruins, a pit of ash and vengeance. Cyrus, standing in the captured palace of his grandfather, chose an entirely different path. There was no massacre. There was no purge of the Median nobility. The city was not plundered. Its holy places were not defiled. Astyages himself, the king who had commanded his death, was not executed, but was taken into the royal household and granted an honorable, comfortable retirement, a stunning act of clemency that would have baffled an Assyrian king. This was not mercy for its own sake. It was a profound, calculated act of state building. Cyrus, after all, was not a foreign barbarian. He was, through his mother Mandane, the direct, legitimate grandson of the man he had just overthrown. He was not, therefore, destroying the Median dynasty. He was simply claiming it. He presented himself not as a Persian conqueror, but as the rightful successor, a changing of the guard, a fulfillment of a destiny that united both branches of the Iranian peoples. This single brilliant stroke of political theater transformed the entire nature of the conflict. This was not a conquest. It was a merger, a unification of two kindred peoples, and the Medes, particularly the powerful nobility who had chafed under Astyages' arbitrary cruelty and who had, with Harpagus, betrayed him on the battlefield, were more than willing to accept this new, vigorous, and merciful ruler who was already half one of them. The result was the creation of something new in the ancient world, a true dual monarchy. The Achaemenid Empire, in its very infancy, was not a Persian empire. It was, and was seen by all, as a Medo-Persian empire. The Medes were not treated as a subjugated people. They were, from the very first day, embraced as partners in the new imperial enterprise. Cyrus did not discard the sophisticated, century-old infrastructure of the Median state. He adopted it wholesale, wrapping his rustic Persian authority in its opulent, established trappings. The elaborate court ceremony that Deioces had supposedly invented to inspire awe, the flowing purple robes, the high tiaras, the layers of courtiers and protocol, the manufactured distance of the king, was not dismissed as decadent. It was recognized as the perfected software of imperial rule, and Cyrus and his Persian court immediately adopted it as their own. The hardy, truth-speaking, horse-riding nobles of Persia now learned to navigate the complex, ceremonial whispers of the Ecbatana court. The capital itself, Ecbatana, was not demoted. It became the first great capital of the Achaemenid Empire, a favored summer residence for Cyrus and all his successors, who, like the Medes, sought refuge from the blistering heat of the lowland plains in its high, cool altitude. It now stood as a co-equal capital alongside the new Persian cities of Pasargadae and later Susa and the magnificent Persepolis. And in those new capitals, the proof of this partnership was carved into the very stone. On the monumental stairways of the Apadana at Persepolis, where subject nations are depicted bringing their annual tribute to the great king, the Medes are given the place of highest honor. They are not shown as tribute bearers, They are shown as officials, as military ushers, often walking hand in hand with their Persian counterparts, their distinct, rounded felt caps, tunics, and trousers, a stark, respectful contrast to the fluted, suppleted robes of the Persians. In this grand, visual propaganda of empire, they are portrayed as partners, as colleagues, as the joint masters of the New World Order. This partnership was above all practical. Cyrus needed the Medes. They possessed a century of imperial knowledge, a tradition of literacy, administration, and governance that the Persians, as a newly risen vassal people, simply lacked. And so, Medes were not purged from the government. They were promoted. They served in the highest echelons of the new administration, as generals, as treasurers, and as governors, or satraps, of the most critical new provinces. The most prominent and chilling example, of course, was Harpagus. His long simmering revenge was not just satisfied, it was rewarded beyond his wildest dreams. He was not given a quiet retirement. He was made one of Cyrus's most powerful, trusted, and ruthless field marshals. It was Harpagus the Medes who Cyrus dispatched to complete the conquest of the West, to subdue the very Lydian kingdom that his old master Astyages had failed to break. Harpagus, wielding the combined unstoppable power of the Persian and Median armies, stormed the invincible Acropolis of Sardis, captured King Croesus, and brutally subjugated the Ionian Greek cities, extending the borders of Cyrus's new empire all the way to the Aegean Sea. This fusion was so complete that for generations, the outside world, particularly the Greeks, could not or would not tell the two peoples apart. Throughout the 5th century BCE, Greek writers, including Herodotus himself, would frequently use the terms Mede and Persian interchangeably. The great epoch-defining conflict that would later shake the Aegean, the wars of Darius and Xerxes, were known to the Athenians not as the Persian Wars, but as Demedicus, the Median affairs. The act of siding with the great Eastern enemy was not called Persianism, it was called Medism. In the Greek imagination, the Mede had simply become the archetype, the very definition of the great, luxurious, and formidable Eastern Empire. This linguistic quirk is the ultimate testament to Cyrus's policy. The Median Empire had not truly fallen in 550 BCE. It had simply and successfully executed a hostile takeover of its own, becoming the dominant, guiding culture of a new, larger, and more dynamic joint venture, a firm that would, under its new Persian CEO, go on to conquer the known world. The great dynastic narrative of the Medes, as told by the Greeks, had now resolved itself, its prophecies fulfilled, its cycle of vengeance complete, its entire state structure, its court, its army, its imperial robes, seamlessly absorbed into the new, larger, and more vigorous Persian enterprise. The story of the Medes as a sovereign people, the one that began with Deioces, had ended in the respectful, clemency-filled capture of Ecbatana. But this is the story as told by texts, by later historians writing of kings, battles, and dreams. The earth itself, the high, silent plateau, holds a different kind of memory, one written not in ink, but in mud brick, ash, and stone, to find the story that runs beneath the grand narrative, to touch the physical world of the Medes during their mysterious, formative years. We must leave the textual drama of Cyrus and Harpagus and travel back in time to the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. We journey south of Ecbatana to a lonely triangular mound rising from a plain, a place known to us as Tepe Nush e Jan. Here in the 1960s and 1970s, archaeologists led by David Stronach, searching for the faint material footprint of this very median problem, began to excavate. They were not seeking a grand capital, but any sign of the people the Assyrians called the Madai. What they uncovered, preserved with an almost miraculous clarity, was not a city, but a small, high, and immensely significant fortified complex, a snapshot of median life and belief from the very moment their state was coalescing. The mound revealed a cluster of remarkable mud brick buildings, a powerful fortress, a columned audience hall, and most importantly, two structures that would fundamentally rewrite our understanding of the Median soul. These were, the excavators concluded, the earliest examples of purpose-built fire temples ever found on the Iranian plateau. This was not a legend of a seven-walled city. This was the tangible physical evidence of the Magi's, the very spiritual cult that would come to define them. The most extraordinary of these structures was the central temple, a building of striking, stark, and powerful design. It was built on a precise, symmetrical plan with a towering inner cella, or holy room, that rose to a height of nearly 30 feet, its mud brick walls preserved in the dry air. The altar, a massive podium of brick, stood against the back wall. But this was not a Mesopotamian or Egyptian temple built to house a golden anthropomorphic statue of a god. The altar here was different. It was a fire altar, its plaster blackened and replastered, time and again, from the residue of a sacred, continuous flame that was kept burning perhaps for decades as the central object of worship. This was the physical manifestation of the new Iranian spirituality, the reverence for Atar, the sacred fire, as the living symbol of truth and the divine presence of Ahura Mazda. The walls of this temple were pierced not with windows to let in light, but with distinctive, splayed internal niches, which from the outside looked like the narrow arrow slots of a fortress, a design that was both defensive and deeply symbolically median. Next to it stood an even older, smaller temple, the Western Temple, a simpler, lozenge-shaped room, also containing a fire altar, suggesting a long developing history of cultic practice on this high, windy hill. Surrounding these holy places was the architecture of secular power, a formidable triangular fort to house a garrison and a hypostyle or columned hall, the first of its kind found in Iran, a clear forerunner to the vast stone audience halls of the later Persian kings at Persepolis. What the archaeologists had found at Nushijaan was the perfect material expression of the city lords the Assyrians described, a powerful local Median chieftain ruling from a fortified manor, who was also the patron of a deep, organized, and sophisticated religious cult. This was the world of deoses and phraortes, captured in a single high-altitude site. But the greatest mystery of Nushijaan, the secret that hushes the historian's voice, is not its life, but its death. The site was not destroyed in a fiery battle. Its walls were not toppled by an Assyrian ram. Its altars were not desecrated by a Scythian raid. Instead, sometime in the late 7th or early 6th century BCE, at the very apex of Median power, likely during the reign of the great Cyaxares, the central temple was deliberately, meticulously, and reverently abandoned. The priests extinguished the sacred flame, The doors were sealed, and then a massive coordinated effort began. Thousands of tons of shale chips, clean and sterile, were painstakingly carried into the holy room, poured in through the roof, filling the 30-foot-high chamber from floor to ceiling. The entire building was entombed, its altar, its niches, its very spirit put to sleep beneath a man-made mountain of stone, before the entire complex was finally, peacefully, deserted. Why? This act of careful, laborious burial remains one of the most profound, open questions in Median history. Was this a ritual decommissioning, an act of supreme piety, burying the temple to protect its sacredness from a world of change, returning its power to the earth rather than letting it decay in the open air? Or, as many historians now suspect, was this a political act, a silent archaeological echo of the very consolidation Cyaxares was undertaking? Perhaps the local lord of Nushijan, the patron of this temple, was one of the last independent city lords, a rival to the growing power of Ecbatana. Perhaps Cyaxares, in his unification of Media, persuaded this chieftain to abandon his ancestral fortress, to relinquish his independent authority, and join the new, centralized state. The careful burial in this reading was a compromise. The Lord would give up his political power, but his gods, his sacred fire, would be shown the ultimate respect, entombed in their holy house forever, safe from desecration. This fire, buried in stone, is a perfect, poignant metaphor for the Median story itself, a vibrant, powerful, and foundational force that was in the end carefully, respectfully, and completely interred, its structures and traditions preserved as the unshakable foundation for the larger Persian-built house that would be built directly on top of it. And so, the sacred fire of the Medes, the vibrant, burning heart of their early faith, lay meticulously entombed beneath a hill of shale at Nush-e-Jan, while their grand imperial court, the very software of their power, was being respectfully absorbed and adopted, its colorful robes and complex ceremonies now worn by their Persian successors. We are left, at the end of our long journey, with a people who seem to hover just beyond the sharpest focus of history, a civilization defined in many ways by its beginning and its end, by the folkloric tales of its unification and the high drama of its dynastic fall. They are a people we see almost exclusively through the eyes of others, the fearful, bureaucratic annals of their Assyrian victims, and the moralizing, dramatic, and often romanticized accounts of the Greek historians who wrote in the shadow of their Persian inheritors. They left us no royal inscriptions of their own, no grand rock-carved boasts, no cylinder of Cyaxares to tell us their version of the story. They remain in many ways the intermediate prophecy of our first section, a power that existed in the crucial space between what was and what was to come. But to see them as a mere prelude, a simple dress rehearsal for the main performance of Cyrus the Great, is to miss their profound, revolutionary, and indispensable role in the story of the world. The Medes were not a failed experiment. They were the essential catalyst, the crucial missing link that made the entire Achaemenid, and thus Greek and Roman, future possible. Their legacy is not one of failure, but of a foundational and ultimately successful transmission. They were, in a very real sense, the true architects of the first global empire, for they solved the three great problems that had, until their arrival, kept the Iranian peoples a scattered secondary force on the world stage. First, they solved the political problem. For centuries, the Iranian plateau was a fractured landscape, its geography of high, isolating valleys a perfect mirror for its fragmented tribal politics. The Median problem was at its heart the Iranian problem, how to bind these disparate, fiercely independent horse-riding clans into a single, cohesive state. It was the Medes, whether through the slow judicial wisdom of a Deioces or the bloody unifying conspiracy of a Cyaxares, who first achieved this. They forged a national identity, a centralized kingdom with a capital, a treasury, and a single royal will. They provided the model, the very concept of a unified Iran, a political structure that Cyrus did not have to invent, but merely and brilliantly inherit. Second, they solved the military problem. They were the people who looked at the terrifying, combined arms war machine of Assyria and the swift, nomadic lethality of the Scythians, and instead of being crushed between these two worlds, they synthesized them. Cyaxares' great reform, the creation of distinct corps of infantry, archers, and cavalry, was a military revolution. He built an army that had the discipline of the lowlands and the speed of the steppe, a hybrid force that was the perfect evolutionary weapon for a highland empire. This was the army that Harpagus defected with, the professional, experienced, and devastating tool that Cyrus overnight found in his own hand, the very engine he would then use to conquer Lydia, Babylon, and the known world. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they solved the imperial problem. They created the culture of empire. From the stark fire temples of their early chieftains to the opulent, complex, and remote ceremony of the Ekbatana court, they established the very aesthetic and ideology of Iranian kingship. The flowing robes, the protocol of the audience hall, the system of loyal vassals, the high priestly caste of the Medjiji, and the very title King of Kings, these were all Median innovations, the software of rule that the Persians adopted so completely that the Greeks could not even tell the two peoples apart. The Persians, in their genius, would later add the bureaucratic brilliance of the satrapy system, the royal road, and a new monumental art style, but the heart of their court, the very scent and feel of their majesty, was a direct, unbroken inheritance from the Medes. The Medes, then, stand as the great bridge, the pivotal, intermediate empire that connected the ancient river valley world of Mesopotamia to the new continental, multi-ethnic world of Persia. They were the ones who, in alliance with Babylon, had the courage to tear down the old, cruel Assyrian order, and in doing so, they reshaped the geopolitical map, drawing the very borders, like the Halys River, that the next act of history would be fought over. They were the vessel that carried the new ethical spark of Zoroastrianism, and they were the Highland state that first demonstrated how to rule a vast, diverse, and mountainous domain. Their empire may have been brief, lasting only 2 or 3 generations at its zenith, but its impact was permanent. The story of the Medes is a quiet reminder that history is often a relay, where the torch is passed from one hand to the next. The Medes ran their leg of the race with a world-changing fire, and when their run was finished, they did not drop the torch. They passed it, still burning, to their successors, who would use it to illuminate the entire known world. And now, as the final fires in the hearth of that ancient Ekbatana palace die down to a soft, glowing ember, and the high, cold silence of the Zagros night descends once more, the story of the Medes themselves settles, finding its own final and peaceful rest.